Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is no gods, no masters in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, Remembrances. I'm hating this, I'm hating this. Lynn tightened her grip on the parallel bars and pressed forward, alternating between exhaustion in her arms and pain shooting up her leg. Kaed walked beside her, standing ready if she fell, but her presence was less than encouraging. Broken, their sessions screamed at Lynn. Useless. Weak. She was getting better, but not as fast as she would have liked. There she was, a grown woman, trying to learn how to walk again while the city fell apart outside. There was a quiet knock on the door and Bolin slipped inside with his usual nondescript grocery bag. A drink would be a welcome relief, at least, and Bolin himself wasn't the worst company. He was a more excitable drunk than Lynn would have liked, but as long as he kept bringing her liquor she didn't mind. Evening, counselor, Kaed said, drawing up some water from a tank nearby and running it over Lynn's leg to keep the skin hydrated. Let's do once more down the bars, okay? You can head out, Kaed, I'll finish on my own. Lynn turned around and prepared to walk the deceptively lengthy path. I'm supposed to stay and then help you back to your room. The counselor won't mind giving me a hand. Besides, don't you have your date to get ready for? Her cheeks flushed. If you're sure. She didn't wait for an answer before ducking out. Bolin set his bag down and went up to the parallel bars. They were a smooth kind of steel, smoother than she liked. More than once her hands threatened to slip. Good news or bad news? Bolin asked. Her first unsteady step sent knives through her leg, flooding up into her abdomen. There's a pain I haven't missed, she thought bitterly. You first. The triads are getting bolder, he said, moving along with her at a crab snail's pace. I can't say I'm not glad they're focusing on the equalists, but if it gets worse we might have to consider more drastic measures. United forces. Maybe. Your turn. I can't walk without feeling like someone's raking coals over my leg. Do you think it's good news or bad news? The only thing she hated more than thinking about her condition was talking about it. Tears pricked at her eyes, and shame followed with them. A section of the bar under her left hand began to twist. I'm completely Lynn fell. The carpet tasted terrible, sweat and feet and any number of unpleasant things she preferred not to think about. She pushed up with her hands, coughing and sputtering while Bolin knelt beside her. Her leg burned as it drew across the carpet, and the pain proved too much. She didn't care. She started to cry. Thick, hot tears dripped down her cheeks as she twisted into a sitting position, and the bars bent away so Bolin could reach her. You should just get a new police chief. Hey. Bolin grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. This isn't you, Lynn, get a hold of yourself. I'm useless like this, she shot back. Lynn bit her tongue to stanch the tears, pressing down so hard she worried she would draw blood. I ruined myself for a man who won't even check on me. We're all busy these days, Bolin said, taking her hand. You're not useless, and you're not ruined, understand? Remember what you told me when I couldn't get the hang of metal bending? You are not allowed to quit. And I'm your boss, so that's an order. She took a slow, shuddering breath to steady herself and felt Bolin's arms wrapping around her back and behind her knees. Reluctantly, she leaned in against him and let herself be carried back into her wheelchair. He was awfully strong, but placed her in the seat with finesse before going to retrieve his bag. Now come on, do you want to be sad Lynn or drunk Lynn? The hallway back to her room was empty, leaving no one to see her blinking away the last of her tears while Bolin walked beside her. At least she could wheel herself around without help. The little bit of autonomy helped keep her sane. Someone had changed her sheets while she was out, but had left the radio on. That infernal Cabbage Corp jingle rang out, sinking into her head like a spinning drill. She bent the dial until the sound died away, and suddenly Bolin was putting his arms around her again, lifting her out of the wheelchair and over to her bed. You don't need to carry me, you know, Lynn said, linking her hands behind his head all the same. I know. The sheets were still warm when he set her down. Bolin eased his arms out from under her, but Lynn kept her grip on him for a moment longer. Sad, she knew, but it felt good. You can let go now, Chief. But this is how Tenzin used to carry me. Right. You want to break out those drinks or what? Soon enough she had a pleasant buzz going. Tingles flooded out from her chest and into her arms and legs, letting her forget the pain for a little while. She hoped it was from the Kaoliang, at any rate. Lin propped herself up against the back of her bed while Bolin brought a chair up beside her, talking about the lighter bits of council business. She didn't ask to hear about any more of the equalist attacks. That could come later. Just then she didn't want to be a cop. She wanted to be drunk. You should have seen Izuna go crazy, Bolin said, slurring his words slightly while his fifth drink swished in his hand. All over a wolf bat. You'd think she believed they could breathe fire the way she dove under the table. She was ready to kiss the janitor who came in and caught it. If I ever get that jumpy, kill me. Lin watched her drink shimmer under the harsh hospital lights. How's Tenzin? His oldest split off from the Avatars group and joined the Kyoshi warriors with her cousin, so I think that's a load off his mind. That was about 2 weeks ago. Other than meetings, he's been staying on the island. He said it was because he had to prepare things for his other daughter's mastery ceremony, but... Bolin took a deep breath. You really want to know? Can't leave me hanging like that. He nodded. Well, I was watching Ikki the other day, somehow I keep getting roped into that. She lures me in with rice cakes and then follows me around and she has no filter. Told me Pema reeled him in because of you. His words landed like a punch in the gut. The neutral almost smile on her face dipped into a scowl, and she drew her undamaged leg up in front of her chest. Figures. She won. She should enjoy her prize. Lin, it's been a long time, why do you still beat yourself up over this? Because it's what I do. She shrugged. You don't have things that eat at you? Things where you wonder how much different everything could have been. Well, yeah, but not with girls, Bolin said, scooting his seat closer to the bed. Usually more about things that affect the city and the country. It still bothers me that May quit over what we did, but with romantic things I just kind of have to move on, you know. The resilience of youth, she muttered. Things haunt you when you get older, kid. All those years I spent with a grudge against my sister and my mother. Tenzin. You and Mako. We get our own spot in Lin Bafong's list of regrets. His attempt at humor hit a sour note. You, not so much. You turned out fine, more than fine. Your brother, it keeps me up at night. Why couldn't he end up more like you? You can't torture yourself for this, Linear. But it's my fault. It's not, okay? It's not. I'm not going to let you drive yourself crazy with guilt. Bolin sunk into the couch, belly still full of noodles. It was so nice and warm in Miss Lin's house while he watched the frost build up on the windows. Outside it was cold and the wind stung at his cheeks, but it was comfortable inside. He wondered idly when his mother and father were coming back. Still, Miss Lin's house was really nice, nicer than their apartment. It wouldn't be so bad to stay there a little longer. On one of the gigantic easy chairs facing his couch, Mako sat with his legs pulled up in front of him, holding his head in his hands. His eyes were wide, darting around the room like he expected something awful to happen. Bolin wished he would calm down. Listening to the radio wasn't any fun with his brother panicking nearby. What's wrong, Mako? He had lost count of how many times he had asked in the past few days. As far as Bolin was concerned, nothing was wrong. They had been stumbling around the streets ever since their parents disappeared, but now that they were in a warm house with a nice lady who fed them, everything was just fine. Mako didn't answer him. Instead he clambered onto his feet and leaned against the back of his chair, looking frantically around the room. He was shaking, Bolin saw. It was warm. Why was he shaking? Mako. Be quiet. With a pout, Bolin sunk further into the couch. He didn't have to be so mean. Everyone else had been so nice, almost kind of sad-looking, but Mako was his usual self. No, he was worse than his usual self, and Bolin wanted to know why. He just wanted to know if he could help. You know Mom says we're supposed to talk about something if it's bothering us, he said sullenly. Shut up, shut up. His voice was hoarse and crackly, worse than it had been days ago. Mako climbed down from the chair, went over and grabbed Bolin's hand as he blinked back tears. Come on. We can't stay here. What? Why not? We just can't, now let's go. Bolin jerked his hand out of Mako's grip. Cut it out. Miss Lin said we could stay here, and I want to stay. We don't even know the way home from here, where are we going to go? Get up. Mako swiped at him, a small spurt of fire tracing along with his fingers. Bolin screamed and clutched at his arm, patting madly at the singed skin while Mako wrenched him to his feet and marched him to the door. Tears slipped down his cheeks. I'm telling Mom, he whimpered. So blame Mako if you want, but I won't have you beating yourself up and hindering your recovery. Lin finished her drink and took the bottle from her nightstand. She took a long pull from it, set it back down, and grabbed Bolin by the collar to haul him up onto the bed beside her. Whoa, hey, Mako's the one that hits on you. No offense, but I like girls my own age. Oh, shut up. She scooted aside and put his head in the crook of her shoulder before wrapping him a powerful hug. You really wanted to stay. I was 6, he said, shifting slightly to position himself away from her chest. With the other option being living on the street. But yes, I wanted to stay. You were being a lot nicer than Mako. Lin held him tight. 2 weeks later. No. There's no spirit to it. I've got to feel it. Mako released the pressure on the strings of his erhu and looked at Huan, who was still shaping a piece of his latest sculpture. It was the 4th such interruption in a half hour, and Mako took a deep breath rather than lashing out. He liked Huan, they were able to brood together for hours in satisfying silence, but being chastised without any further instruction was beginning to wear on him. There would be a chance to work out his frustration if they could get away from everyone later, but until then he was stuck. Look, I know I'm not about to go play a concert or anything, but I thought I got most of that last part right, Mako said, tightening up the tuning on the outer string. Tutors were kind of hard to come by when I was growing up. All the notes were fine, that's not the problem. There was no emotion to it, it was too clean, too refined. It should bring a tear to your eye. He thought about it for a moment, picked up the bow again, and played the last few bars of his song with more vibrato. Huan smiled, an unfamiliar sight to Mako even after a month in Zaofu, and waved his hand, making part of the sculpture curl away from him. That's it, there. Can you feel it? The pain, the sorrow. All Mako actually felt were the slight vibrations in his fingers, but he nodded all the same. If anything he thought it sounded worse, wavering and warbling while Huan bent the last bit of metal into place. There. What do you think? What's this one, sweetie? Su came down the steps to the garden behind the estate, idly twirling a bit of iron above her hand. Mako rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the ground at her feet. She looked so much like Lin, even if they couldn't act more differently. He was glad, in a way, even if he caught himself missing Lin's roughness every now and then. He hoped her rehab was going well. Su went up beside Mako and put her hand on the small of his back while they looked at the sculpture. It's supposed to be all the pain and darkness of music, Huan said, stepping back to survey it with them. Don't you ever want to make something more cheerful? Maybe reflect some of the positive emotions in the world. He gave his mother an affronted look. Where's the pathos in cheerful? Where's the crushing weight of locked-away memories thrust into the limelight? Besides, it was Mako's playing that inspired me. Is that so? Su asked. What locked-away memories were you spilling out, I wonder? Dead parents. Ruined relationships. I just run the bow over the strings until I find something that sounds good, he lied. Su ruffled Huan's hair, much to his annoyance. Well, it looks great, honey. You should both be proud. Mako, a word. They left the gardens, going by a display of meteorites in a grotto where Opal sat with a book. Nearby Mako could hear the harsh metallic clanging of the game Huan's younger brothers had come up with. Most of the windows on the back of the house were thrown open to take advantage of the beautiful day, except for the one in Asami's room, which was shut tight and curtained. Did the water heater break? Mako asked. Need something warmed up. Lin's letters never mentioned your sense of humor. She's not a very jokey person, I guess. His face flushed. I didn't realize I was so interesting that letters needed to be written. Oh, she talks about you a lot, but that's not why I pulled you away. She motioned to Asami's window. I think your friend might need some cheering up. She's been shut up there in her room for 3 days now and lots of sake is missing. You understand that I don't usually have a positive effect on Asami's mood? Mako asked. It's been a long time since she was even happy to see me. The only person that did more than tolerate me is back on Kyoshi Island. So frowned and put a hand on his shoulder. I wouldn't ask if I wasn't concerned. This kind of thing doesn't get better on its own. I would try, but I'm swamped with preparations and I think it would mean more coming from you, anyway. Lin either hasn't told you very much about me, or she's been lying through her teeth. Neither. I still have every confidence in you. She went to speak with Opal while Mako started back toward the house. Even in his wildest dreams as a child, he never imagined staying in such a palatial estate, to say nothing of how kind everyone had been. Being near a close, loving family, it was a sweet kind of pain. Mako took the back stairs to their part of the guest wing, where Asami's door was closed tight. He knocked lightly and poked his head in, where the scent of rice wine hit him like a punch in the face. Asami sat at the foot of her bed, running her finger in slow circles around the top of a nearly empty bottle. He had seen her without her usual hairdo and makeup most days since they left Republic City, but never while looking so miserable. Ugh, it smells like a distillery in here, guess I found the sake. What's left of it, anyway? One of the floorboards under his foot creaked, drawing her attention. Hey, Mako. Want to get drunk with me? It's noon and you smell like you've already had enough to take down an elephant rhino. I honestly don't know whether to be impressed or horrified. Either way, you're done. Asami held the bottle up and waved it at him. Mako stepped into the room, took the bottle, and set it on her desk. Cut that out. How long have you been at this? She shrugged. Hours. Days. Doesn't really matter. You finish with that silly sculpture. Yeah, and it looks great, not that you've seen it, Mako said, clasping her arm and easing her up until she stood unsteadily, wavering back and forth with a sullen look. He guided her over to the chaise longue beside the desk and set her down, leaving her to nuzzle into the cushion while he opened the curtains. Asami hissed as the light flooded in. Oh, stop. You'll forget what daylight looks like at this rate. Did you know the air nomads used to ferment figs and peaches, have their bison eat them, and then have drunken flying jousting matches? He rolled his eyes. I'm pretty sure that's not true. Come on, you can't stay in here all day with all the light blocked out, it's not healthy. What do you care? You're off being all buddy-buddy with Art Boy and chorus with her, she said, trying to add venom to her slurred words. It had the opposite effect, making her sound comical rather than threatening. Asami reached for the bottle on the desk, but Mako moved it away from her as he sat down, taking a quick swig. It burned all the way down. That stupid, rough, beautiful rich girl. Mako had half a mind to remind Asami that she was attractive and exceedingly wealthy herself, but decided on another direction. I hate to shatter your ego. Well, that's not entirely true, but people don't go catatonic when you break up with them. We do continue having lives outside of our relationships with you. I mean, look at me. We had that awful breakup and I only walked away with one serious injury, remember? Yeah, I remember. Hey Asami, whoa. Mako ducked in time to have a plate sing over his head and explode into a dozen pieces on the wall behind him. He peeked up from behind the table and saw his girlfriend grabbing a bowl from the cabinet. Did I forget your birthday? Mako asked, picking up a shard of porcelain. He liked that plate. Because I can have 1,000,000 or so flowers here in a minute. You're a fucking triad. Oh. Right. He had wondered when that was going to come up. Still, he thought, there was no excuse for using perfectly good flatware as a projectile. A few sparks started swirling around his hand, he tamped them down. Asami hated when he started firebending in front of her. Not that Mako could blame her. It took him years to stop seeing the mugger who killed his parents in every bit of flame around his hands. Let's maybe take a deep breath and stop throwing things. I didn't show up at your house and start chucking teapots when I found that equalist mask you left here. I thought. The bowl exploded as it hit the table. Her aim was improving, and his ears rang. I thought we just weren't going to talk about that stuff. Footsteps, getting closer. He hoped she wasn't going for the knives, they were expensive. Asami came around the table, thankfully barehanded, and Mako stood up. That proved to be a mistake. Her hand cracked across his face and her nails followed with it, leaving 4 bright streaks running from his ear to his mouth. Ow! She wound back to get him again, but a quick sidestep let Mako grab her wrist and hold it over her head. Stop that! He made another mistake by focusing on her free hand instead of her feet. Asami drove her shin up between his legs as hard as she could, and in the sickening, horrifying instant after the contact but before the pain, Mako lost his grip on her wrist. He staggered back as fire spread up through his abdomen, grabbing at the table to keep himself upright. Low blow, he mumbled, his head spinning. How could you do this, Mako? Those animals killed my mother, they killed your parents. You think I don't know that? He asked through a wheeze. I found the guy who killed my parents. What kind of job prospects do you think some street orphan has? Why don't we go ask your brother, the council page? Asami asked. Mako gritted his teeth. Bolin doesn't have a record. I did all that stuff to keep him out of trouble. I did what I had to do and I'm not going to stand here while you talk down to me for it. You fucking benders, she muttered. And there it is. Us terrible benders, we get every advantage without even trying. I'm sure you've gone and cried in every room of your mansion over all the injustice, Mako spat back. Asami ran her hands through her hair while he fell backwards into a seat. I love you, you idiot, she said, taking a step forward. Mako snapped his legs shut, wincing in pain as he did, but she only ran her hand over his cheek, fingers following the markings she had left. A few tears rolled down her cheeks. I wanted to tell you that tonight. I wanted to do a lot of things tonight. Don't get your hopes up, Mako gasped out. I love you too, you know that. But I can't be okay with this. I don't know what your reasons are, and I don't want to know. So that's it, then. She dipped down and kissed him, lipstick and tears smudging up on his lips. Yeah. That's it, Mako. A fresh wave of pain rocked him as Asami strode away and slammed the door behind her. That kick put me out of action for months, I'll have you know. I couldn't even commiserate with myself over our breakup. Asami rolled her eyes. Boo-hoo. On the other hand, you are getting better at breakups, Mako said, passing the sake back to her. You didn't attack Korra at all. Maybe next time you'll give breakup sex a try. Watch it, my kick's still as good as it ever was. And I didn't get that much better. That day we all found out she was the Avatar, she was waiting for me at my house. I went at her with a poker before she put a knife in my hands and asked me to kill her. Well, you didn't, we can call that a marginal improvement. Yeah. Big improvement. She took a belt of the sake, sat up against the wall, and patted the empty space she left. Mako sat down beside her, letting Asami put her head on his shoulder. I still love you, you know. Not like that, not anymore. But the way you love a really old friend or that cousin you only see every few months. I've got a few cousins like that, Mako said, taking back the sake. A pleasant warmth was snaking through his arms and legs from his stomach. Love you too. Can't think of what I'd be like if you weren't my best friend. And with friends like you. Who needs enemies? Asami finished, laughing a little harder than she would have sober. Not us, that's for sure. Oh, and just because it's going to keep me up at night if I don't ask, your thing with Korra, that wasn't because of me, was it? Asami hiccuped and snatched the bottle out of his hands. And you want to talk about my ego? No, Mako, you didn't turn me off men. That's not how it works. I like men, I like women. Let that keep you up at night. She swished around the last of the sake and drained the bottle. Have you heard from Jinora? He raised an eyebrow. Asami hadn't spoken a word about her the whole month they were in Zaofu. A few days ago, yeah. Right before she left with the others for their recital in Ba Sing Se. She's doing well. She asked about you, actually. Wanted to know if I became a nun and got those silly arrow tattoos. More like she wanted to know how you were handling your airbending. I know you're avoiding it at all costs, so I told her I'd have to get back to her on that. She twirled her wrist in a circular motion, letting the air swirl around her hand until there was a funnel almost the size of her head hovering over her fingers. Mako watched, intrigued. He had seen and been on the receiving end of every kind of bending, but there was an odd sort of mysterious grace to airbending that the other forms lacked. Even Korra managed to look somewhat refined when she was airbending. It must have been beautiful when Jinora used it. Well, there are plenty of other airbenders for her to worry about now. I never asked, how'd your friends react to that? She began to shake slightly against him. About as well as you'd expect. Asami couldn't hold the papers with her trembling hands. New airbenders. Air Nation returns. A dozen other papers had seized upon the story, despite her threats to buy them out and shut them down. Her face was plastered on as many front pages as the avatars. Normally that gave her a small boost of pride. Now it made her consider throwing herself out of her office and onto the streets below. If the looks she was getting didn't kill her first, of course. The lobby had been a gauntlet of withering glares, and even her secretary Rei gave her a crestfallen little glance before turning back to her work. The top latch of the window required some effort to reach, but it unlocked easily and she slid the glass to the side, feeling a cold rush blast through her office. Where everything had been silent, now there was the muted noise of the street with its cars and voices far below, dulled by the roar of the wind. She never realized how terribly alive it seemed, how angry it felt while rushing at her, attacking her. It was a long way down. Through all that air. Near the main entrance, there was a throng of reporters trying to work their way inside like they had been all day. At least their security personnel were loyal to their paychecks and not ideology. Asami wondered idly how many of them she could take with her if she landed in the crowd. The thought brought a morbid smile to her lips, and as sickening as it was she knew it was the first real smile she had felt in days. Panic would set in long before she hit the ground, she knew. Her body would panic, no matter how much her mind wanted to die, to disappear, and force out a gale to break her fall. No way to explain that to dozens of voracious reporters. Didn't they have anywhere else to be? Thinking of doing us all a favor. The sharp, gravelly voice made her start and grab at the window frame. She turned around slowly, her heart pounding with adrenaline from almost being frightened off the 36th floor. Fu was there, standing in the doorway with some of the upper cadre of the Equalists, or at least the parts of it that hadn't been killed or captured on Air Temple Island. It looked strange to see them all there, barefaced and in suits rather than uniforms. If you're here to lambast me, I'm afraid I've already beaten you to it, she said dimly. Me and every person I passed in this building today. No. Fu held up a newspaper with Korra's beautiful, forlorn face adorning the front page. We're here about these reports of you planning to leave with the Avatar. And we want to know why you did it. The airbending. Why? Why? Anger threatened to push out her fugue for a moment. Do you think I planned any of this? Having my warehouse blow up with me inside? Becoming a conduit for airbending? It wasn't my idea to leave the spirit vines there, if you'll recall. It wasn't me that said it was the last place the Triads would look. His jaw clenched. And the Avatar? Leaving tomorrow? She turned back to the window and slid it closed. I don't want some anarchist threat hanging over our heads. Now get out of my office. It won't be your office once you leave. You missed the meeting, but the board appointed me as the interim CEO in your absence. Still in the city and they're already digging my grave. Those snakes. Of course they did. And the rest of you put him in charge, too. There was a deafening silence of assent. I guess no one gets to call you lieutenant anymore. Now, while it's still my office, get out. With hard, icy glares, the last people Asami thought of as her family turned their backs on her and left. Fu opened his mouth to say something, but roughly shut the door instead. Asami felt her composure wavering, and no sooner had she locked the door than she sunk to the floor beside it and cried. I'm confused, you don't own the company anymore. No, it's still my company, but the board put someone else in charge. Legitimate business is so complicated. Anyway, it's not like they would have been thrilled with it, you had to know there'd be blowback. Asami quietly produced another bottle of sake from behind a pillow on the chaise longue. I expected a little loyalty. It's not like I was hiding blood bending from everyone, I got smacked with powers I never wanted and never asked for. Mako was intent on cutting her off, and took the sake out of her reach. They were loyal. Just not to you. She gave him a long, slow nod. Besides, everything went to hell with them after we left, better to have washed your hands of the whole thing. They were always a pain in our necks, but they weren't chucking bombs and killing people when you were running the show. Now come on. He hopped to his feet and offered Asami his hand. Can't stay in here all day. We don't have to go practice Bagua forms or anything, but at least come outside. I'm sure Bader has some engineering project you can look over. Plus this room really needs a chance to air out. Asami clasped his hand and took a few shaky steps with him to the door. I have wanted to see that game Wing and Wei made up. Something that makes that much racket has to be exciting. The sharp, reverberating clang of the disc on one of the center posts rang through Korra's ears as she dove to meet it. She sensed the big hunk of metal before she saw it come screaming around her post, whipping through the air on nothing but momentum. With a twist of her body, she reached out and grabbed the bit of easily malleable thunderbolt iron inside the disc, let it fly just past her, and reversed it. She smirked as the disc bounced off the posts, but the buzzer went off far too early for her to have made a goal. One of the twins she still wasn't sure which called down from above the field. Technical foul, holding the disc. Point, Kuvira. These rules don't make any sense. Korra shot back, still panting as she wiped the sweat from her brow. It's like you're making them up as you go along. It's a brand new game, Avatar, it's bound to have some growing pains, the other twin said. Ordinarily you'd get another foul for arguing with the ref, but that was match point. Korra rolled her eyes and climbed out of the field. Mako and Asami sat in the stands trying to decipher the rules until they noticed her. At least they were getting along. Asami gave her a small, subdued wave, which she returned. Small steps, she told herself. Mako turned the rules pamphlet he had been given upside down. What's the difference between a point and a power? The referee's mood, I think, Korra said. The buzzer sounded again. Game's over, can't give me another foul, she muttered, sticking her tongue out at the twins. Well, I thought you were really good out there, Asami said. Oh, thanks. Korra rubbed the back of her neck, suddenly feeling very flush in the cool afternoon sun. A bead of sweat snaked down her exposed midriff, and she rocked back and forth on her heels for a moment. I'm going to get cleaned up. Mako went to argue with Wing and Wei about the ambiguity of some of the rules while Korra disappeared into the locker room. A chill hit her once she was out of the sun, cold and sharp while she picked up her clothes and brought them over to the shower stalls. One of them was already running. All Korra could see of its occupant was a mass of hastily pinned up black hair, but the soft humming told her who it was. She hesitated, resting a hand over her stomach and all the scars littering her skin. Oh well, she thought. She really needed the shower, anyway. The shower stalls only came up to about her neck, and Kuvira glanced over as the cool water began to beat down on her shoulders. Don't worry about Wei, he's a stickler with the rules. You played well. Seems like you're almost totally healed up. Korra touched her surgery scar, poking at the slight indentations where the sticks had been. She applied a little pressure to her ribs, feeling only a slight sting rather than the sharp shocks of pain that had plagued her weeks before. Looks like it. It'll be good to get back to what I was doing before. As much as she tried to pour conviction into the words, they felt hollow. She liked being in Zaofu. She liked feeling like a normal 24-year-old woman and not the broken wreck that looked at her in the mirror every night. She liked spending time with Kuvira. They're still working on Iway, Kuvira said. You don't want to go to Ba Sing Se without a destination in mind, you could spend years scouring it without results. Most people don't realize how massive it is. Let's hope we find out something soon, then. Korra splashed some water over her face and shivered. My mom would drag you back if you left before the celebration tomorrow, anyway. The water in Kuvira's stall cut out, and Cora snuck a sidelong glance as she padded over to the towels. She bit her lip. Kuvira was finely defined muscle all over, like her, but she carried herself with all the grace that Cora lacked. Her back was to Cora, thrusting the long scar running from her shoulder blade to her hips into prominence. There were other, smaller scars on her body, and seeing them so casually on display set Cora at some small ease about her own. At least Kuvira understood. She wrapped herself up in a towel and unpinned her hair as she turned around, leaving Cora to about face so fast she overshot and lost her footing. Grabbing at the controls for the faucet proved fruitless, and she only had time to bend some water beneath her to cushion her fall. Ow! You okay? Cora twisted around just in time to see Kuvira's head poke over the stall door, her face reddening so fast it looked as if all the blood in her body flooded into her cheeks. A quick pang from one of her healing ribs made her hiss in pain as she tried to cover herself. Yeah, I slipped. All right, Kuvira swallowed hard, but held her gaze for a long moment before turning away, examining the tile design on the wall. I'll be out here if you need me. She smirked in between grimaces of discomfort. I guess we're even, then. Carefully, Cora got back to her feet and bent all the water down the drain. She slipped into her underwear and the long green tunic she had been given, working her arms back and forth until the sleeves fell the way she wanted them. It hung loosely enough to not bother her scar and even covered most of it, and that was fine with her. Didn't break anything else? Kuvira asked as Cora came back into the changing area. She hung her simple metal necklace around her collar and stood up. Nope, I'm durable enough to survive myself. Cora tapped on her ribs. Mostly. So, what now? You don't have to go back to work, do you? Kuvira thought for a moment. No, that should all be done for the weekend. I'm sure my mom will rope us into preparation work if she finds us. We can't exactly hide out in here all night. With a conspiratorial glance at the door, Kuvira reached into her bag and produced a bottle of Beiju. Why not? Do you just carry around liquor in your bag? Cora asked, cocking her head. Really strong liquor? She shrugged. I have a stressful job. Plus someone's been making off with all the sake lately and this was a birthday present. They did not, in fact, hide out in the locker room all night. After the sun had set and nearly a third of the Beiju was gone, they snuck back to the house through the garden, almost falling over one another as they critiqued one of Huan's new sculptures. What is it? Cora asked, knocking on the side. A big, busted needle. It's supposed to be music, I think, or something. Who knows with him? Cora knocked on it more insistently, tipping the whole structure on its side and sending them running. After sneaking past a sleeping Opal and Bader Sr. in the living room for reasons neither of them fully understood, they found themselves in Kuvira's room. It was nestled in a corner of the east wing beside her parents' suite, with a small balcony that overlooked the city to the south. Cora flopped down on the couch inside, curling up and relaxing against one of the arms to make room for Kuvira. Soft, Cora said, letting her cheek rest on one of the back cushions. Kuvira sat down beside her, some of her grace gone with her sobriety. So, Kuvira pricked up, leaning toward Cora. A smile crept across her lips. Yes. How'd you get that scar on your back? Her expression dropped somewhat, but she turned around and pulled up her tunic so Cora could see her back. Cora traced the scar with her fingers, making Kuvira inhale sharply as she reached the bottom. I was wondering when you'd ask about that. Cora offered her the Beiju, and she took a short drink before turning to face Cora and passing it back. I was a sergeant in the army before the Queen defunded it, in the military police. We kept hearing reports of units getting brand new equipment that ran down so fast it was like it had never been replaced. Was it new equipment? Cora asked. Her thoughts were hazy and she was rather focused on the movements of Kuvira's lips, but she kept up with the story. It was, at least on paper. This was tens of millions of yuan's worth of armor and weapons, so there was a huge paper trail to follow. My superior didn't think it was anything worth following up on, but we had enough latitude that we could conduct our own investigations. Manufacturing, transport, base quartermasters, everything checked out. Meanwhile more equipment kept failing. She took a deep breath and pinched the bridge of her nose. No one could prove what happened to all the old stuff. We were told it was destroyed, but we never saw any record of that. There was always some reason they couldn't produce anything. Some news places picked up the story and they finally had us open an official investigation. It didn't help, we kept getting blocked off by the officers who were in charge of the equipment turnover. One of my corporals and I went to a base outside Jailing. It was the main supply depot for the Southern Earth Kingdom. Kuvira paused, chewing on the inside of her cheek until Cora set her scarred hand lightly on her leg. You don't have to keep going. It's okay. Like I said, we went to Jailing. The base commander strung us along for most of the day. We couldn't get an actual answer to any of our questions, and the story he gave us didn't make any sense. First they were going to send things off to be destroyed, then other bases were going to send things to them, just a lot of inconsistencies. Finally we decided to call it a day. What happened with the new equipment? I don't think it ever existed. Kuvira began tugging on her braid, hands clumsily falling over her hair and pulling it loose. We went to leave that night, and I turned back to signal the guard at the gate while my corporal went to start our truck. She kept a straight face, but what tears she couldn't bite back rolled silently down her face. It was dark, I remember it was dark, and then, everything lit up. I could see the car park as if it was daytime for a second. This wave of heat hit me, I went deaf, and then next thing I knew I was in the hospital. The windshield from our truck hit me in the back, she said as she began to shake, pointing over her shoulder to where the scar began. And then it shattered. Mom told me they were picking pieces out of my skin for 2 days. By the time I got out of rehab the military had already been gutted, and my partner died because I couldn't leave well enough alone. Cora opened her mouth to reply, but the words got lost on the way to her mouth. Instead she put her hand out and pulled Kuvira closer, head swimming. She let Kuvira rest against her, still trembling, and slowly ran her hand over her back while tears dripped down on her arm. Her thoughts were hazy, and Cora nodded off some time after Kuvira, held tightly against her. Chapter 22, Night of 1,000 Stars. Mako had a fairly good idea about who had tipped over Huan's sculpture the night before, but confronting the Avatar and the second most powerful person in the province seemed like a bad idea to him. Instead he contented himself with convincing Huan it was a freak gust of wind and suggesting ideas for a new project. He wandered about the estate grounds, drifting through a haze of expectant inertia, when he found himself in a small section of the garden half hidden by a retaining wall. Zaofa was too close to the equator for winter to count for much, and neat little rows of flowers bloomed up at him in an artful blend of reds and blues and yellows. So was kneeling down in front of one row with several flowers still in pots beside her, slowly transplanting them with earth-bending rather than a trowel. I'm impressed, most people don't even know this part of the garden exists, she said, keeping her focus on arranging the leaves of a small peony. Right, Mako remembered, she probably noticed him through the ground long before he knew where he was going. Were you looking for me? No, just taking a walk, everyone else has something to do for that party tonight. Almost everyone. She patted the empty space next to her. Here, why don't you give me a hand? I know you can't exactly extort a bunch of orchids, but it's very calming. His eyes widened, and she finally looked up at him until he knelt down beside her. I guess Lin really wasn't lying in those letters, Mako said, taking up an unused trowel and digging where Su pointed. You're being awfully casual about it. My sister isn't the only one who has experience with triads, you know. I fell in with some bad people when I was younger, too. Watch your hands. She finished aerating an orchid and nestled it in the hole he dug. It's strange. So many of her letters read like a police report, all clipped and businesslike, but when she wrote about you, so much emotion dripped through the page. I tried asking once or twice why she spent so much time writing about some kid who wouldn't stop hitting on her. Mako felt his cheeks redden. But she always ignored me. I hope you understand that I couldn't pass up the chance to get the story from the other side. It's pretty complicated. We've got a few hours before the festivities start, she said, sitting back. Try me. You're really not going to quit, are you? Lin had you built up as this big, bad triad boss, and you show up as a snarky kid who really doesn't seem that bad. Either things have changed a lot since I ran with the Terra Triad, or I'm missing a piece of the puzzle. Mako smoothed over a bit of dirt around the base of the orchid's stem. Well, to start, the Terra Triad doesn't exist anymore. We absorbed them, along with the others. There's one triad now, the one I was in charge of. It was partly a power thing, partly to put a single force against the Equalists because the police couldn't do a thing to them. And they ended up crippling themselves anyway, killing the one person that made them more than a bunch of idiots in masks with fancy toys. I could have asked Asami if I wanted that part of the story, Sue said, twisting some metal on her bracelet into a helix. I want to know about you. I want to know why every last thing you do is so personal to Linear. Disappointment, I guess. Mako stood up and wiped some dirt from his pants. I know I'd be disappointed if someone kept screwing up despite my best efforts. And even after all the grief we've given each other, it's not, excuse me. He wanted to tell her, he wanted to tell someone, he wanted to let out some of the guilt building up inside and threatening to burst. Instead he walked away, blaming the moisture in his eyes on the wind and ignoring Sue's requests for him not to leave. The garden was otherwise empty, as was the small earthen grotto between it and the house. Asami was off with Opal putting the finishing touches on their dresses, and he had no idea where Korra and Kuvira were. His room was as quiet a spot as any. Mako fell onto the bed, turning over to stare at the canopy, and pulled over the phone from the nightstand. He took the handset off its cradle, but dropped it back into place. There was no one he wanted to talk to. He didn't like crying, it always seemed like pointless emotional masturbation to him, but he let the tears trickle down toward the bed sheets all the same. I'm sorry, he said, unsure of who he was addressing. No, I know what you mean, but I don't have a lot of accessories that go well with red outfits. Green is kind of our thing. Asami nodded as she looked through Opal's jewelry box, picking up silver bangles and thin platinum necklaces. She held a glittering choker up to her neck, but it clashed too much with the deep scarlet of her dress. Her hope of finding something in gold was waning rapidly, but there was a great deal of jewelry to go through. I did notice the green theme, Asami said with a weak smile. We can go to the shop if you want. Opal paused to reach over her shoulder and grab an earring. Oh, the backing twisted up again. She sat beside Asami and took a pair of needle nose pliers from her desk, slowly straightening out the backing on the earring. Asami watched her with her tongue stuck out, working the metal back into its proper shape manually where her siblings might have simply bent it into place. That must get kind of annoying, huh? Asami asked. Opal set the pliers down and tried the earring. It slid smoothly into place. Oh, the metal bending. I don't really think about it. She found the earrings twin and set them aside. I mean, Dad and Bader can't bend either, so it's not like I'm the only one. And we're the smart ones anyway. Opal gave her a chipper little grin and shrugged. Besides, I don't like dirt and dust that much. I think being an airbender would be a lot cooler, soaring around and everything. You think it's cool, right? Her fingers twitched, air rustling the fabric in her lap while a tingling ran up her arm and into her chest. Opal gasped and watched her, almost bouncing in her seat with excitement. I don't really think about it, either. Fair enough. Still, I wish I had been in Republic City when all those people ended up getting airbending, Opal said, standing up and taking Asami's hand. Come on, I'm sure there's a store around here that sells gold jewelry. They changed and went into the city, taking the tram between the residential and commercial domes to look around the high-end boutiques. Opal seemed drawn to the silver, and even though Asami thought she had quite enough of it already, she left her to her own devices while she picked out a few things that would go better with her dress. With several hours between them and the party, Opal didn't seem ready to return home, and instead led Asami off to get their hair and makeup professionally done. She made a small show of resistance as her host checked the tram timetables, but inwardly she was glad. It would be nice to look and feel like her old self. Her hair was a mess of knots after 3 days shut up in her room, and what makeup she had in her bag wouldn't match her outfit. See, isn't this nice? Opal asked from the adjacent salon chair while their hair dried. Asami nodded and flicked through her magazine, blowing the pages around for Opal's amusement. I'm glad you're here. Kuvira doesn't ever like doing this stuff with me. She won't even borrow the jewelry I tell her would look good on her. It's like she thinks she's still a soldier and has to stay within regulations. A pit settled in her stomach, confusing and infuriating all at once. She had managed to avoid Kuvira all month for the most part, as well as she could while they were sharing a house. Her interest was so painfully obvious that even Mako was aware of it, and Korra made no signs of disliking the attention. Asami wanted Korra to be happy, she had been through enough hell in her life to deserve that. She only wished it involved her more. They would occasionally cross paths in the hall, tension thick in the air between them, and Asami would be torn between wanting to tell her off and agonizing over how much she reminded her of Korra. She hated that, how effortlessly similar they seemed. She hated the quick, casual touches they shared, hated the quiet look of self-assurance Kuvira always had. She hated the way Kuvira's face would intrude on her thoughts of Korra and make her come harder. Really? Your sister seems to have a knack for snatching things up, Asami said, her voice dry. Opal shifted uneasily in her chair and twiddled her thumbs. Sorry. I shouldn't be dragging you into my problems. What exactly is the problem? She asked apprehensively. What's going on with you two? Relationship issues. And Korra? Opal cocked her head, threatening to send her hair off balance. What's the avatar got to do with Oh, she mumbled as her discomfort grew. I might regret asking this, but I don't understand and I'm a naturally curious person, so what happened? I sort of broke up with Korra while we were on Kyoshi Island and now Kuvira is really obviously interested in her, Asami said, speaking so fast she nearly stumbled over the words. And Korra's not exactly uninterested, either. She fixed a lock of hair that fell down between her eyebrows. It doesn't sound like anyone did anything wrong. But I didn't end things because I don't like Korra, I do. The airbending was just too much to deal with then. And now? Asami set the magazine down. It's not as big a deal as I thought it would be. And I'm terrified that I ruined my chance with her. Some of her hair kept falling out of place, no matter how insistently Opal set it back. And I thought relationships with guys were complicated. I guess they still are, if you're Huan. Trying as she was not to cry and ruin the makeup that had been so carefully applied, Asami almost snorted with laughter. I knew it, no one willingly spends that much time around Mako unless they want something. You guys do. He's become surprisingly tolerable, she admitted. So what are you going to do about all this with Korra? Opal asked. Asami picked up the necklace she had bought and let it fall across her fingers. That's still a work in progress. The wind whipping through her hair made her feel so very alive as she pursued relentlessly over the Zaofu skyline, shooting coils from her hip and forcing them to carry her across the rooftops like stilts. All of the city stretched around her in easy view, metal glittering in the low afternoon sun on each and every surface. Cool air blew over her exposed arm, providing a pleasant chill to contrast with the warmth of her armor. The scar there still ached in her downtime, but Korra was learning to live with the pain. She fired a coil to wrap around an airship mooring beneath her, providing enough leverage to catch up to Kuvira, or so she thought. As she arced through the air, her shadow gave her away, and Kuvira dove below the skyline. Korra heard the whip of her coil latching onto an overhang on the building in front of her, using the momentum to propel herself back up and well past Korra. Hey, she yelled into the wind. She thought she saw Kuvira glance back for an instant, but then she was gone again, working her way over a tower in a powerful vault. Rather than throw her other wire, Korra came down on the roof, coiled herself up, and launched with as much air behind her as she could call up. She rocketed above the city, looking down at the different districts in the moment where she hung before coming back down. All the domes seemed so small, so fragile nestled in the mountains beneath the bright, clear sky. Quickly, so quickly it made her stomach turn, she began to descend, and Korra had to push a massive blast of fire out from her feet to break her fall. A flock of birds scattered at the heat, and she looked guiltily at the scorch mark marring the roof before leaping off the side. With a thrust of her arm, the wire on her hip shot out and snared around an exposed bit of railing on the next building. The spool whirred as she reeled up, releasing her hold on the metal when she had built up enough momentum to throw herself over the side. Korra landed on the roof with a thud and rolled to break her fall, only to wind up in shadow. Begrudgingly, she glanced up at Kuvira, sitting on a vent with a thin sheen of sweat on her face and neck. She smirked and hopped down. What took you so long? You dropped below the skyline, Cora said as she got up, bringing them to eye level. I thought we were keeping above it. I missed my mark and had to recover. She gave her an innocent shrug. I thought we weren't firebending, either. Her smirk turned into a grin as she took a step closer to Cora. Heat radiated off both of them, partly from their armor. The unspoken challenge blazed in Kuvirao's eyes, inching toward hers, drifting so close Cora could see a little bead of sweat snaking down beside her soft, pale lips. It wouldn't have been very sporting to race against a splat on a roof, Cora said. I guess not. Kuvirao's legs bumped against hers, a muted pressure beneath the tight weave of her armor. More heat flared up, making Cora drop her gaze and turn her attention to the event hall several blocks over. They'll be starting soon. Should we get ready? Race you back, Kuvirao said, playfully smacking her hip. Their competition became somewhat less exciting when the skyline dropped off as they neared the residential district, leaving them to throw themselves down the street with their wires. After the spools became ensnarled and they both came down hard on the sidewalk, they decided to put the race off until another day. Instead they took the tram back to the house, comparing cuts and scrapes before Cora healed them. No, that one was from yesterday, Kuvirao said, pointing out the raw skin on Cora's shoulder. When you made that ridiculous diving save in the last power disc match. If it's ridiculous but it works, it's not ridiculous. Once she had washed the sweat and grit away, Cora brought her dress, still zipped up in its protective sleeve, down the hall to Kuvirao's room. She could hear the shower still going, and she waited outside, toying with the metal frame of one of Huan's paintings while she did. Opal's door opened and Asami stepped out, her gown shimmering under the hall light. Light red lace on her sleeves wove into the deep crimson silk flowing past her knees, where elaborate straps snaked down and secured her heels. A pair of gold bangles and a thin matching necklace dotted with rubies caught the light and contrasted sharply with her sleek flow of long, black hair. Cora forgot herself for a moment, only snapping back to her senses when Opal bumped her foot on the door frame following Asami out, nearly tripping over her own gown. Wow, you look great, Cora said, feeling a sudden flash of ungainliness when she saw how they carried themselves. She stepped in front of her still concealed dress, worrying how plain it would seem in comparison. Thanks. Opal handed Asami her clutch and she resisted the urge to run her hand through her hair. Are you heading down there with us? We can wait for you. No, we'll catch up with you, I still have a whole lot of fabric to figure out, Cora said, motioning to the garment hanging behind her. The shower cut off. Her expression dropped. All right. They walked off, leaving Cora to take her dress and shoes out of their bag and hold them up. Su had gotten her an azure cheongsam that reached down to her ankles with light silver silk around the edges. It was sleeveless, Cora's only request. She was going to learn to carry her scars if it killed her. The seamstress substituted the usual floral pattern running down the side for a design that resembled fire from one angle and water from another. For shoes she opted for simple, comfortable silver flats after admitting she had no experience with heels. Kuvira poked her head out of the bathroom, hair pinned up once more. Dress looks great. Can't wait to see what it looks like on you. Go on in, I'll be there in a minute. Carefully, Cora bumped her head against the wall to calm herself down and took her things into Kuvira's room. It looked much the same as it had when she stumbled out that morning, but more details stuck out to her without any beiju clouding her thoughts. The room was large, but the furnishing austere, as if transplanted from a barracks. Her bed sheets were neat, without a crease to be found, and the couch's pillows had been smoothed out, leaving no trace of the indentations they left from falling asleep there. The desk by the far window was clear of everything but 3 small paperweights near the back, a glass block, a bar of platinum, and a wooden cube, finely cut and varnished. Her dress lay draped over the desk chair in its protective sleeve. Apart from the paperweights, the only decoration in the room was a ceremonial military myodeo in a glass case on top of her dresser. Cora hung her dress on the edge of the wardrobe and examined it more closely. The edge is blunted, it's no good in a fight. Balance is terrible, too. She turned and saw Kuvira nodding toward the myodeo, loose hair spilling over her bathrobe. The belt was undone and hanging loosely at her sides, leaving only her hand on the lapels to keep it from falling open. Cora caught her eye after lingering on the robe for several moments, and motioned to the paperweights. What are these for? Kuvira padded over and picked up the platinum. Things that can't be bent. Yet. You can't bend platinum, everyone knows that. Even I can't do it. 77 years ago everyone knew you couldn't bend metal, either. And then my grandmother did it, Kuvira said, handing the block to her. Are you so sure it can't be done? It was cool in her hand, with a comforting weight unlike the steel on her armor. Cora tried to reach into it, into the underlying lattices that metal bending depended on, but she was unable to get a grip on it. If anything, it seemed less like metal and more like water, with a disquieting stillness as it sat defiantly in her palm. Maybe another time, she said, setting it down between the glass and the wood. Kuvira nodded and set her dress at the foot of her bed, sitting down beside it to braid her hair. Her fingers worked quickly, ever aware of the event hall gleaming through the twilight outside her window, and tied off the braid with a small silver clasp. Cora turned pointedly away as Kuvira stood up, and all she could hear over the blood pounding in her ears was the sound of the bathrobe hitting the floor. Taking care not to damage the fabric, Cora lifted her dress by the bits of silver in the embroidery and eased it up onto her shoulders, fastening it and smoothing out the sides before stepping into her flats. She twisted her hair into a low bun, stuck in a decorative pin to keep it in place, and she was ready. You clean up well, Cora. Kuvira had opted for a high-collared cheongsam of dark green silk with white gold embroidery that cut off just above the knee and a pair of black satin gloves that went almost up to her shoulders. The slight bit of eyeliner she wore, identical to her mother's, stood in sharp contrast to the skin around it, and the admiring gaze on Cora. Her cheeks flushed. Yeah, you too. The green is nice. If you want earrings, you'll have to raid Opal's room, Kuvira said, deciding against a simple silver choker. They're not pierced, actually, Cora mumbled back, rolling one earlobe between her thumb and finger. Ready? Yeah. Kuvira offered her arm, and Cora linked her own through it. Let's go pretend everything's fine and there aren't crazy anarchists running around. Even the tram they took to the main dome had been bedecked with multicolored garlands to commemorate the founding of Zaofu, as had all the streetlights. The guards whose schedules put them on shift during the festivities looked forlornly at the partygoers, and Kuvira spared an apologetic glance for one of her friends who had been pressed into being a doorman. All of Sue's meticulous planning came to fruition when they walked into the event hall. Large round tables covered in bright white cloth stretched back to the far wall of the massive room. 4 rows of crystal chandeliers scattered countless tiny sunbursts over the room and guests. Flowing, expertly wrought decoration lined the walls, catching the light on all the myriad surfaces and metals that blended into the installment. People moved about the room and formed a sea of colors with their clothing while a band to one side warmed up in front of an empty dance floor. Cora paused for a moment to process it all until Kuvira took her hand and led her to their table with her siblings, where Asami was trying to get Opal not to listen to a story Mako was telling about them. That is not how it happened, Asami insisted as they sat down. Mako rolled his eyes as she looked at Cora's dress and gave her an approving nod. Well, that's how I remember it. Maybe if you hadn't hit me in the head so hard afterward I'd have a better recollection. Mako made an exaggerated show of rubbing the back of his head while Sue took her seat on the other side of the table in all her finery. Some of her jewelry caught almost as much light as the chandeliers above them, and Opal cocked an eyebrow. Was the diadem really necessary, Mom? Oh, we only do this once a year, why not do it to the nines, she asked, inching her plate into alignment with its neighbors. Besides, I seem to remember you asking to borrow it last week. She blushed and sank in her seat while more guests drifted in. Even Toph deigned to make a brief appearance after dinner started, mentioning how nice all the decorations looked before walking off and laughing while her daughter fumed. Bader Sr. took her outside for a few minutes, leaving their children and guests to their own devices as the first course was cleared away and the band opened up with a slow waltz. Opal pulled Mako onto the dance floor, earning him smirks from Cora and Asami until he vanished in the crowd. Would you like to dance? Kuvira asked, laying a gloved hand softly over Cora's fingers. 2 women dancing. Who's going to object? There was a not-so-hidden challenge in her words as her gaze slipped past Cora, and rather than risk any unpleasantness Cora turned her hand over, clasped Kuvira's, and stood up. It wouldn't be such a terrible thing, she thought, until she remembered that she never learned how to dance. A combat water-bending form was the closest equivalent she could draw on, and that seemed like it would be rather out of place. Her chest felt flush beneath her dress, not helped by the slowly growing number of gazes she felt on her. I don't know how to do this, she admitted in a whisper. Kuvira put one of Cora's hands on her shoulder, brought the other out to their side, and settled her free hand on Cora's hip with a squeeze. Just watch my feet. I'll go slowly. Kuvira nudged one of Cora's feet with her own, moving it into place before drawing back the other. Cora watched, and then followed an instant later. And a quarter turn this way. That's all it is. The satin of Kuvira's gloves moved smoothly against her hand as their fingers laced up. At least the burning in her ears blocked out any discomfort from the scar tissue on her arm. A new part of the song picked up, slightly faster than the overture, and Kuvira increased their pace while telegraphing her movements enough for Cora to follow. When they had finished another half-turn, she saw Sue and her husband behind them while Asami had paired off with Huan. See? You're a natural. She shook her head clear and looked back at Kuvira, wearing her sage little smile that made her look like she knew something Cora didn't. The hand on her hip drifted down to the side of her thigh, warm through all the layers of fabric. Cora shivered and tried to quickly catch up to the turn Kuvira led her into. Light on my feet, that's all. After a few minutes, the song ended, and they separated with small bows to one another. The motion all over the dance floor stilled, and Cora would have liked to sit down and deal with the lightness in her stomach if the band hadn't moved into another number. Kuvira danced with her brothers, as did Cora when they freed up. Wing stepped on her toes and Huan seemed rather uninterested, but Wei and Bader Jr. were more attentive, and even Mako was surprisingly competent when he found himself pushed into the rotation after he finished a dance with Huan. You're really good at this. She let Mako dip her back, oddly at ease in his grip. Well, dancing was a required skill to get into the triads, he said, bringing her back up. Asami taught me when we were dating. There are an awful lot of galas and formal events when your brother's a politician, and I've never done things in half measures. He took her hand and put her in a quick twirl before pulling her securely back into place. Cora had to admit Mako had a paradoxical knack for making people feel safe. Jinora had been right about that much. I can see that. Okay, I think I'm about all danced out here. With a thunderous crescendo, the band finished their song, and right on cue an army of caterers arrived with the next course of dinner. The scent of poached turbot made her realize how hungry all the dancing had made her, and she had to resist tearing into her plate when she sat down. When she had hunted down the last bit of rice, Cora let Sue steer her through the room like her father had done, introducing her to people from other parts of the province who had come for the celebration. She had a full stomach, and so she bore it with good grace, made even easier by the knowledge that there was no speech looming ahead in the evening. Not for her, at least. Sue seemed to draw her energy from the address she was to give the partygoers. That should do it for now, Sue said, patting Cora on the shoulder. Thank you for indulging me. Asami was exasperatedly recounting to Opal the actual version of events that Mako had distorted earlier when she returned to their table, fighting interjections from him by puffing air at his face every time he tried to interrupt her. The small display of airbending seemed to delight Opal more than the story, and even Cora had to smile at it. At least she wasn't looking in disgust at her own hands when a gust rushed out anymore. It was a rough kind of airbending, hybridized with the quick, precise jabs of her particular chi-blocking form, but it was still a marked improvement. Cora had traced out a rough Bagua circle in Sue's training ground for herself weeks ago, and more than once she had seen Asami studying the figures etched into the ground. Her nerves were on edge, considering the result of the last gala she attended, but there were no attacks, no intrusions as the night wound down. Sue made her speech with gusto, and though Cora thought she liked to hear herself talk a bit too much, the story she spun about founding Zaofa was interesting enough for Cora to forget the anxiety pric cling at her. Her hand balled up into a fist and opened back up constantly until Kuvira put her hand over it without a word, still watching her mother speak. She took a slow, deep breath. Dessert eventually came, tea and lotus seed paste that had been painstakingly worked into the shape of a Zaofa dome. It seemed like quite the extravagance for something they were going to break apart and eat, but Cora enjoyed it all the same after admiring the craftsmanship. They were in the host's party, obligated to stay as the evening wound down and the hall began to clear out, but Cora felt no rush to leave. As it got later and more people left, everything began to feel much quieter as they drank and talked. The band shifted to a more relaxed, lounging pace, and Kuvira shrank in her seat as Sue's eyes lit up. Kuvira. No, Mom. Oh, one song, Sue said, almost rocking in her seat and bumping against her husband. You have such a lovely voice. Dad. Bader Sr. only shrugged apologetically, unable to deter his wife's energy. Kuvira sighed, and Cora looked curiously at her. Is that an order, Governor? Only if you won't do it because I asked nicely. She pinched the bridge of her nose, drew her hand away from Cora, and stood up. The silk of her dress shimmered under the lights as she hopped up onto the stage. After a moment, she looked back at their table and whispered something to the band leader. Their music faded out for a moment as they retuned, running through a few bars, and Kuvira tapped her microphone a few times to test the feedback. Sue brought her husband back onto the dance floor, and Asami half-heartedly accepted an invitation from Bader Jr. as the music swelled and Kuvira locked her gaze on Cora. When I look in your eyes, I see the wisdom of the world in your eyes. I see the sadness of 1,000 goodbyes. When I look in your eyes. Her heart jumped, sending a fresh flush across her skin. Kuvira grinned as she paused, keeping time by tapping her foot. Sue and her husband swayed while the dance floor filled up again. And it is no surprise to see the softness of the moon in your eyes. The gentle sparkle of the stars in your eyes. When I look in your eyes. The champagne hadn't affected Kuvira as much as the beiju the night before, and she moved with all of her usual grace without actually stepping anywhere at all. Her hips rocked in time with the beat, and her shoulders worked in counterpoint as she moved the microphone from side to side between verses. In your eyes, I see the deepness of the sea. I see the deepness of the love. The love I feel you feel for me. Bader Jr. suppressed a yelp as Asami stepped on his foot. Autumn comes, summer dies. I see the passing of the years in your eyes. And when we part there'll be no tears, no goodbyes. I'll just look into your eyes. Cora's thoughts were hazy. The back of her neck burned, but the heat refused to stay put, drifting down to her chest and stomach before settling between her legs. She shifted in her seat, chewing on her lip and fighting to keep her breathing even. Those eyes, so wise. So warm, so real. How I love the world your eyes reveal. The music faded out against the applause from the guests who remained. Mako smiled to himself and sipped his tea. Subtle. Kuvira bowed and slipped off the stage before she could be pressed into another song. The band continued where they had left off with slower numbers, and when Kuvira returned to the table Cora saw a blush breaking through her makeup. I think I'm going to call it a night before my mother gets any more ideas, she said, her unspoken invitation indicated by the hand she offered to Cora. Her hesitation came mostly from only just getting feeling back in her legs after having them pressed together. Kuvira led them quietly back to the tram, and they sat in silence as the car sped back to the residential dome. It was empty apart from them, and Cora wrung her hands as it glided over the rails. Her whole body felt fuzzy, anticipation and fatigue fighting inside her. Entirely too soon they were walking into the house. Cora stepped out of her shoes somewhere in the hall and left them behind as they went into Kuvira's room, still quiet, still austere. Her clothes were in a pile by the desk where she left them, but she went instead to the balcony while Kuvira undid the straps on her flats. They couldn't pick a better night for this, Cora said, leaning on the balustrade as Kuvira joined her. Soft lights strung along the streets below made the metal buildings gleam before fading up and into the inky blackness of the night, where countless stars glittered. Kuvira's bare hand brushed on hers, and Cora quivered. My mother does know how to throw a party, I'll give her that. She pushed herself away from the balcony and turned to Kuvira, offering one hand in an exaggerated flourish. Dance with me. I thought you were all danced out, Kuvira said, but took it all the same. She pulled Cora close, leaving only a few inches between them, and put Cora's hands on her shoulders before grabbing Cora's waist, firm and warm beneath the silk of her dress. This has all been so perfect. I don't want it to end. I know the feeling. They swayed softly, about all Cora could manage, while Kuvira led and she followed, glancing down at their feet every so often to make sure she had the right movements. Neither of them knew how long they stayed there, moving gently in a circle while the lights below burned down. Cora felt her eyelids growing heavy when she spoke again. "You sing beautifully," she murmured, closing some of the distance between them. "I can, with the right inspiration." "Oh?" Cora asked, slipping her hands down to Kuvira's sides and laying her head on her shoulder. It was dangerous territory, she knew. She didn't care. She was so warm, so close, and Cora felt her tapping out a slow beat on her hip. "I've got you under my skin. I have got you deep in the heart of me. So deep in my heart, you're really a part of me. And I've got you under my skin." She felt a tingle snake along her spine, through her heart and up to her ear where Kuvira was singing softly, mouthing and humming the words more than anything, so that Cora was the only one who could possibly hear her. "I have tried so, not to give in. I've said to myself this affair it never would go so well. But why should I try to resist when I know so well that I've got you under my skin?" Heat flared in her while Kuvira's cheek brushed on hers, her lips so close to her ear that Cora could feel the warmth of her breath on her skin. She gripped at the sides of Kuvira's dress as their pace slowed, leaving them drifting across the balcony. "I would sacrifice anything come what might. For the sake of having you near. In spite of a warning voice that comes in the night and repeats in my ear. Don't you know, you fool, you never can win. Use your mentality, wake up to reality." Her lips brushed on Cora's ear before she pulled back slightly, leaving them gazing at each other. The distance between them closed entirely. They stood still, bodies pressed together, hands slowly exploring, while Kuvira almost whispered the last lines in a low tremolo. "For each time I do, just the thought of you makes me stop before I begin. Because I've got you under my skin." Cora's lips meeting hers ended the song. It was a nervous kiss at first, cautious and light, but deepened as Kuvira pushed back, her tongue flitting for an instant over Cora's lips before they parted and let her in. Cora could taste the sweetness of the champagne on Kuvira's lips, and she explored almost greedily. They mixed and mingled, reveling in the new tastes of one another while they pressed together more tightly so that heat and desire flowed freely between them. When they had to come up for air, Kuvira pulled back, smirking as Cora tried to follow her lips. "Breathe, Cora. I want you," she said desperately, slightly slurring her words. "I want you, Kuvira." She thought she felt a little jolt from Kuvira as they stood in silence for a moment, Cora wavering while the head rush wore off, Kuvira mulling over her terribly unromantic confession. Heat and want and deep, aching need had robbed her of whatever eloquence she had, to say nothing of the drinks. She felt her eyelids growing heavy and fought to keep herself coherent. "Well, here I am," Kuvira whispered back, taking a step from Cora to lead her back into her room. Oh no, she thought. The bed. She would be out as soon as she got near a pillow. "Couch." Kuvira asked, dipping down to nibble at her throat before setting Cora down on the side of the bed. She wavered, giving Kuvira a bittersweet smile, and fatigue won out as her head hit the pillow. Before she drifted off, Cora was dimly aware of a kiss on the back of her neck and an arm settling protectively over her. Chapter 23, Skeletons in the Closet. Sleeping in a cheongsam was not a wise move, Cora thought as her eyes flitted open. Still on her side at the edge of the bed, the soft ache in her muscles told her she hadn't moved all night. The door to the balcony was still thrown back, unclosed, and a small bird was tittering through its late morning song on the balustrade. Her head was still murky, not nearly as intensely as it had been the night before or the morning prior, but she was still hungover. The champagne was insidiously effective. The weight of Kuvira's arm shifted on her side and stomach, her hand burrowed snugly between Cora and the bed sheets. It made warmth flare between her legs and snake up her spine, blocking out the nausea for a brief, lovely head rush. Snippets of the end of the night came back as she laid there, returning to the house, dancing, Kuvira singing to her, kissing her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, making Kuvira stir against her. Yes, that had happened, she knew as clarity slowly returned, and was not a product of her imagination. Not anymore. "That's the second night you've spent in my room," Kuvira mumbled, removing her arm and using her elbow to prop herself up. Cora turned over and saw she was in shorts and a sleeveless shirt. The definition in her arms and legs was as sharp as ever, flexed as she supported herself. She must have gotten up after Cora fell asleep and changed. Somehow it bothered Cora that she had slipped away in the night, but she returned. I should start charging you rent. Good luck. Her voice crackled, in need of water. I don't exactly have money. I'm sure we could work something out. She had a plainly hungry look on her face, licking her lips as she brushed some hair out of Cora's face and adjusted the collar of her gown. Not sure why, but I feel a little overdressed, Cora said. Kuvira swept her leg over and straddled Cora, reaching back for the hem near Cora's feet. We can fix that. Her fingers tugged at the fabric, lifting it slightly while she waited for Cora to respond. Kuvira's hips rocked back and forth on her, stoking the fire more and more until it became a sweet, dull ache. She hoped they wouldn't be missed at breakfast, and undid the fastenings beside her neck. It was all the assent Kuvira needed, and she bent the rest of the fastenings loose before throwing back the outer layer of the dress. Her wraps had come undone in the night, and they fell away as she sat up to shrug out of her cheongsam. Kuvira didn't wait before cupping her cheeks and kissing her. It was not one of the tentative, curious kisses they had shared the night before, but a desperate, craving kiss with all manner of want behind it. I need you, it said. I need you now. Cora moaned softly while Kuvira's tongue flitted at her lips. She brought her hands up under Kuvira's undershirt, fingers tracing over the hard, sculpted muscle of her stomach and up to the swells of her breasts. Her hips bucked up into Kuvira's, desperate to close the small distance between them. The frame underneath them creaked as Kuvira wrapped her arms around Cora and moved her to the center of the bed before lying down next to her, suckling at the delicate flesh of her throat. She took Cora's hand and guided it down to her bare panties. Show me what you like, Kuvira whispered, lacing their fingers up together. Cora's hand brushed over her clit through the fabric, sending a sharp jolt of pleasure radiating outward. Show me how to touch you. With a pause for another deep breath, Cora pushed her underwear down with her free hand, uncomfortable where it stuck to her sensitive skin, and let herself lay bare for a moment. Cool air wafted in from the balcony, carrying the heady sense of their arousal through the room. Kuvira slowly looked her up and down, neither lingering on nor ignoring the scars that covered her skin, with the same hungry look in her eyes. Trying to act out at least a modicum of teasing, Cora took her time in guiding their hands back down, pausing to let Kuvira feel the hair beneath her stomach. Kuvira moved their fingers in circles, disturbing the hair and provoking an odd, but not entirely unpleasant, sensation before they moved on. Cora controlled the position of their hands, but Kuvira determined the motion, seeking out her clit and rolling slowly up and down. Did Asami touch you like this? Kuvira asked, the words barely a hum on her neck. Cora shook her head while fighting not to buck her hips. No. That beautiful girl never had her fingers on you, never made you shake like this. She gasped, the combination of their hands and Kuvira's lips and tongue on her neck threatening to overwhelm her. Already there was a soft ache on the side of her throat, indicative of a forming bruise, but she didn't care. She just wanted to come. Her free hand sought out her breasts and she rolled one nipple between her fingers, overloading herself with stimulation. A cry escaped her, quickly silenced by Kuvira's lips on hers. Their hands built up a rhythm, working back and forth at a mounting pace and only occasionally tripped up by the growing slickness coating Cora's thighs and the sheets beneath her. Her legs were weak, twitching every so often, and her breath came in hot, panting gasps. Cora arched her back to press into their hands, letting tightness build up in her chest. To her credit, Opal did knock, but didn't wait for a response before opening the door. Hey, Mamo, what the fuck? Opal stumbled back, tripped over herself and barely missed hitting her head on the wall behind her. Cora yelped and twisted away from the door, leaving her bare back exposed while an altogether different kind of heat flushed over her skin. There was a low, irritated growl from Kuvira, who closed her free hand into a fist and bent the door shut by its knob. Mom needs you. I didn't see anything. There was a frantic set of footsteps leading away from Kuvira's room and back into the living area. Cora was still twitching when Kuvira cursed, rolled off the bed and went to throw on some more clothes. Wait, Cora mewed. Sorry. It's probably official stuff. Kuvira planted a soft kiss on her lips and fixed a government pin on her tunic. I'll make it up to you, okay? I promise. She ducked out of the room, still muttering under her breath about her sister while Cora laid there, panting and shuddering and debating whether or not to try and salvage her orgasm. Turning onto her side had jammed the last joint of her small finger against her thigh, and the residual embarrassment still gnawed at her. Not to mention going back solo wouldn't be nearly as satisfying, she thought. No, the moment had passed, and irritation began to replace pleasure in her mind. Even when she was a hormone-addled teenager, she would be allowed to finish up rather than be dragged off to a training session half-cocked. Cora clenched her jaw and took a deep breath before wobbling over to her clothes. Damn it, Opal. When she was dressed and acutely aware of the dampness on the thighs of her pants, Cora trudged out of the room and went to the central part of the mansion. She still needed water, more than she had when she woke up. In the sunken living room where they had their more casual meals, all of Kuvirao's siblings were strewn about on the couches in varying states of consciousness except for Opal, who looked hyper-aware as she tried and failed to hold a teacup steady and look anywhere but at Cora, along with a barely awake Asami nodding off against Mako's shoulder. What happened to all of you? It looks like a bufang bomb went off. There was a drinking contest with some of the caterers after you left, Huan mumbled, holding his hands to the sides of his head. Mako won. Firebender metabolism, he said, pulling his winnings out of his pocket. Can't be beat. Liquor goes right through us. One of the twins groaned from the couch they had claimed. Ugh, never again. Asami picked herself up from Mako's side with a quizzical look, sniffing the air in short bursts. Cora blushed and tried to snap her legs together, but it was too late for that. They locked eyes for an instant before Asami saw the hickey on her neck and she looked pointedly away, redness mounting on her face. Opal, look at me. Did your mom say anything about what's going on? Cora asked, trying to shift their attention. She remained exceedingly interested in the floor in front of her. Something about BA Sing SE, there was a call and it just cut out, they can't get anyone now. Cora's expression darkened, her annoyance with the girl pushed to the side for the moment. We might have to leave, then. Fine. Mako slammed his fist down on the arm of his couch, making everyone grumble. Fine. I've been kicked out of better homes than this. The urge to roll her eyes was nearly irresistible to Cora. We're not getting kicked out. You have? Asami asked. Well, yours. Remember that time your dad caught us in flagrante delicto with that shock glove? Mako. People. Asami hissed, a moment too late. All of the bufangs were already leaning forward with interest. No, please, don't stop on our account, Bader Jr. said. It'd be nice to have a distraction from the pounding headache. They were denied any further regaling and Asami any further mortification by Kuvira appearing from the west corridor. Cora, Mako, she began, then added after a moment, Asami. Could you come with me, please? She led them past the various offices on the west side of the house to a pair of large mahogany doors at the end of a hall. They shuffled in after her and found themselves in Sue's office, a tastefully understated room filled with comfortable furniture and little relics from her past travels. Sue was at her desk, tunic pressed and hair coiffed, the bags under her eyes serving as the only reminder of the night before. We have a problem, Kuvira said as they went into the room. Opal said something about BA Sing SE. Mako asked. She stiffened a bit at the mention of her sister before Sue nodded. I was on the phone with the Geological Service, trying to get a survey team here to redraw our topographical map. She paused and looked wryly at Cora when the call cut out. It happens, but the line was dead a moment later when I called back. All the lines into BA Sing SE are dead, all the emergency channels are down, and I just spoke to the governor's offices in Yan'gao. No one can get through to the capital. A tense silence fell over the room for a moment as they all exchanged glances. Mako had to sit down, and Cora felt a knot growing in her stomach. We should have pressed way harder, she said. You should have let me at him. Sue got up and nervously bent one of the prongs of her necklace. There are rules about these things, Cora. We made every effort to find out what he knew, but he was always the one handling interrogations, Mako said, to which Kuvira nodded. Asami crossed her arms. It's not like it matters much now. We have to get to BA Sing SE as soon as we can. Have you ever been there? Mako asked. It's huge and not exactly easy to get around. The Red Lotus could be anywhere, if it is them behind this. Cora felt sparks threatening to crackle out from her hands in frustration. There's only one place they could be going. The palace. They'll want the Earth Queen dead and leave the rest of the city to pull itself apart in the chaos. So, we have to go. I can get you an airship. Pepper will be faster. We'll have to bypass the desert, Cora said, looking at a map of the Earth Kingdom on the wall. That should make it about 5 days. 4 if we rush. Then what are we waiting for? Mako asked, springing to his feet and pulling his contest winnings out of his pocket again. We've got our supply money right here. Nervous determination burned in his eyes, making Cora's next words all the more difficult. Mako, the city could be falling apart. We may need an army to get it under control. I need you and So to go back to Republic City and get as much of the United Forces as you can. You're a counselor's brother, and Sue's sister is the chief of police and Tenzin is her cousin. Your voices together have to count for something. Please, she added, seeing the worry set over him. As long as we can leave things here well defended, Sue said. But I've been there, I know the streets, Mako began, but she stayed resolute. All right. If that's what you need, Water Tribe. She clasped his shoulder. Thank you. Then I'm coming with you, Kuvira said, quickly working her hair into its usual braid. I've been to the city too, I used to live there. Absolutely not. Sharpness rang in Sue's usually calm voice, taking them all aback. You are not going to be acing SE. That's an order. You'd rather let them waste time getting lost. When she received no reply, Kuvira slowly removed her government pin and set it on the table between the couches. I won't, Mom. Kuvira, I need you here. I promised I'd keep you away from that city. I promised I'd keep you safe. She whirled around to face her mother, fists clenching in a way Cora had never seen when they spoke. Promised who? The father that abandoned me? That left me here, that wanted nothing to do with me. Her voice cracked, and thick tears threatened to spill down as she tried to clench her jaw. Yes. I promised your father. Sue closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Prince Sue. Open council meetings always put Lin on edge, this one doubly so now that all she could do was walk slowly with the help of a leg brace. Her presence was not in any official capacity, but as that of a citizen of the United Republic, like all the people around her in the council chamber gallery. The police had thoroughly checked everyone in attendance, even her at her insistence, but there was no way to turn off her cop's instincts. She studied every face, inspected every nook and cranny of the room, and swept her gaze over the space under the seats around her. There were far too many important people in attendance to rule out an equalist attack, increased security, or not. Aunt Lin, stress is only going to prolong your healing process. Let the cops do their job. Ikki tried giving her a comforting glance, but Lin was having none of it. She didn't know which was worse, that her doctor had insisted on an escort out of the hospital, or that her ex-boyfriend's daughter was the one to do it. At least she had calmed down since getting her arrows. Lin regretted missing the ceremony. Ikki was, surprisingly endearing, in an arm's-length kind of way. I'm still a cop, kid. She seemed to take affront to that, as if her tattoos magically made her an adult. Well, they would have an air nomad society, Lin thought. But 14 was 14, and anyone younger than her was a kid as far as she was concerned. Lin nudged her shoulder, bringing back Ikki's usual beaming expression. There were worse people to have around, she supposed. What's happening, anyway? Hell, you probably know more than me, Lin said. All I get are snippets from Bolin and what I read in the papers, which is next to nothing ever since Future Industries bought most of them. I only know it's so important that Bolin decided to make it public. Ikki swooned at the mention of her precocious crush, but Lin was spared any further conversation by the counselors filing out of their offices at the back of the room and toward their table. Everyone stood, and Lin couldn't stop the surge of shame that rushed through her when Ikki had to help her to her feet. The brace helped keep the worst of the pressure off the healing skin, but it would be a long time before she was back to normal. Maybe never. She didn't have the resilience of youth to fall back on. Ikki guided her back down when everyone else took their seats. Thank you all for coming today, Bolin said, twirling his gavel on the table. We decided to open this meeting to the public because of the magnitude of the threat the Equalists pose to all of us, and to our city. The crowd murmured some agreement before he continued. Too many people have died already for their false notion of equality. Benders and non-benders alike are being terrorized, all victims of their zealotry. We've come here today to tell you that enough is enough. He pounded his fist on the table with every word to drive his point home, getting the onlookers going with each rap of his knuckles. They drank in his words, pounding their feet and making the chamber shake. No, Lin realized. It wasn't diffuse, raucous motion rumbling the floor, it was coming from a single, well-masked source. Bolin. Lin watched as he continued his speech. He gave no indication of earth-bending, or at least nothing anyone else could detect without a seismograph. She would never tell anyone, least of all him, that he was frighteningly skilled, maybe even more so than her. It made him dangerous. His speech was the usual politician's fare, empty platitudes, honeyed words, lots of talking without actually saying anything. The crowd was eating it up. They're buying this. And these people vote, Lin thought with a shudder. The safety of all our law-abiding citizens is paramount. Bolin stopped, wide-eyed, and threw his gavel into the crowd, guiding it by the brass on the handle. It struck a man as he was standing and pulling an Equalist bandana up over his face. The gavel came in right between his eyes, landing with a sharp crack and sending him over the back of his seat. Lin threw herself over Icky as the guards rushed in to grab him, fighting the man as much as the onlookers around him. She glanced back as the girl clung to her and watched them drag the man away. The mask slipped off as he struggled, and Lin only got the briefest of glances at him, but that was enough. He's no Equalist, he's Cheng. One of Mako's people? Lin tried to stand up for a better view, but her leg refused to cooperate. Instead she looked back at Bolin as Icky burrowed defensively against her, floating his gavel back to thunderous applause. There's more going on here. As I was saying, our first concern should be the safety of our citizens. I think that minor disturbance only underscores my point, he said, giving the crowd a calculatedly restrained smile. And that's why we need to present a united front against these terrorists. One force, behind one person. That little, he's really going to do it, Lin muttered, drowned out by the clamoring around her. Someone with proven experience, Bolin said. Someone cool under pressure. Someone like Counselor Tenzin. If anyone could be said to be the most surprised person in the room, it was Tenzin himself. All the color drained from his face as Bolin went on amidst confused murmurs. Re-elected with a completely unanimous decision, son of Avatar Aang, father of the new Air Nation. I can't think of anyone better suited to steward us through this crisis as our president. Tenzin's objections were drowned out by the throng that Bolin had whipped into a frenzy. The actual vote was swift, and the rest of the council looked as blindsided as Tenzin as they were forced to go along with the crowd, with any dissent from the other councillors shouted down. Bolin appointed himself to the humble vice presidency in the same vote, a footnote against the chants of Tenzin, Tenzin, Tenzin. What's happening? Icky asked, holding tightly to her charge's hand. Lin looked grimly on as reporters pushed through to what had just been the council table. History's first unwilling coup. When the audience and press dispersed and the remaining government positions had been doled out among the other councillors, Lin pulled herself to her feet by forcibly straightening out her leg brace. Icky helped her from the gallery to the front of the room, where no one but Bolin seemed to have any idea what was going on. Dad. Icky ran up and jumped into her father's arms, though it could do nothing to take the look of shock off his face. Does this mean you're the boss of everyone now? I'm not sure, sweetie, he said, absently rubbing her back. With them still reeling, Lin took the opportunity to pull Bolin aside, limping with him in tow to a corner of the room. A word, Mr. Vice President. Good to see you up and about, Chief. He put a hand on her arm, from which she pulled away. Don't worry, you'll have your job back when you're ready. That guy with the bandana. I've arrested him before. He's a firebender, not an Equalist. He's with the Triple Threats. I guess he had a change of heart, Bolin said with a shrug. Self-hating bender? I've seen stranger things, believe me. Maybe the Equalists forced him into whatever they were planning. Or maybe someone put him up to it. Someone very familiar with the triads. Lin, I think being cooped up in that hospital made you a little stir-crazy. He gave her one of his politician's smiles, the kind that didn't go all the way up to his eyes. A lying smile. Besides, can you think of anyone more trustworthy to get us through these difficult times? You set it all up, she said, moving back. The public meeting, the assailant all to get the crowd on your side. To prop Tenzin up so you can swoop in when he caves under the pressure. In case you weren't paying attention, I already had the crowd on my side. This isn't over. I'm going to get the truth out. Oh, Linear. He stepped past her to go back to the others, shooting a dangerous glance her way. Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I'm sorry, I didn't want you to find out like this. Sue's pleas fell on deaf ears, and Kuvira only sat on the couch beside Korra, reeling as if she had been punched in the gut. Mako and Asami sat opposite them, looking as surprised as anyone else. How was I supposed to tell you? Over dinner? Can you pass the salad? By the way, did you know you're a princess? Kuvira looked brokenly at her mother. You didn't want me to find out at all, did you? It wasn't my choice, honey. Sue knelt down beside her, pulling her into a weak, one-sided hug. Those were your father's wishes. But I did it for you, not for him. How do you even know Prince Sue? Mako asked, leaning forward. You're not exactly a royalist. Seems like you only pay lip service to the queen and the monarchy. She went to one of the bookcases lining the room and picked up a pair of slit-eyed goggles that sat in front of an old picture. Kuvira held her head in her hands and began to rock slowly back and forth. I lived in a sandbender commune for a few years in my 20s in the Si Wang Desert. Very ascetic, very spiritual. I was able to teach some of them metal bending, so they accepted me. The little iron they had for their skiffs was more valuable than water out there. A small smile played on her lips as the memories caught up with her. A few of us went out to trade with one of the border villages, but we hit a rough patch on the way back and had to stop to repair our skiff. I was rigging the sail when this half-naked idiot came stumbling over a dune, ready to keel over from thirst. The sandbenders I was with had to return to the commune, so I carried him back to the border village. Little skunk weasel tried to pinch my ass, Sue said, rolling her eyes. And that was the prince? Korra asked. She wrapped Kuvira up in her arms, stroking her half-braided hair while she fought back whimpers. When I finally got some water in him, he told me his name was Zu. It's a common enough name that I didn't think anything of it at the time. He told me he was out there seeking spiritual enlightenment in between bad come-ons. I told him he might want to think about bringing more provisions the next time he wanted to wander around the desert like a fool. Impulsive, woefully unprepared, kind of lecherous. Mako sat back in his seat. Sounds like royalty. Korra glared at him. Okay, not water tribe royalty. She had sent the glare his way more for the sake of Kuvira, but his comment did serve to jog her memory. Korra was a princess as well, if not at the same scale. That would have to count for something, she thought. I didn't find out until a few years later, when I tried to buy all of this land from the crown. My purchase and build requests had been fast-tracked by a Prince Zu, and he recommended making Zaofa the provincial capital when everything was reorganized decades ago. He came to visit when the first domes were finished and made sure to tell me that he packed plenty of supplies for the trip back. You were with him, Sue said, sitting down beside Kuvira and absently finishing the braid in her hair. You couldn't have been more than a year old. You were so beautiful. So what happened? Kuvira asked, her voice dull and flat. Why did he bring me here again and just leave me? I don't know, darling. He only told us your life would be in danger if you stayed in Ba Sing Se, and he begged me to keep you away from the capital, away from all the politicking there. You're too far down in the line of succession to be a target, 14th the last time I checked, but I never found out what danger he was talking about. I told him what he was doing was cruel, but he was terrified of something, and eventually I tried to focus on giving you the best life I could here instead of being angry and disappointed with him. Tears hit Kuvira's lap, and even Asami looked like she felt sorry for her. All those things you've ever said about the monarchy, the royal family, did you mean them about me, too? Sue shook her head and lightly kissed her daughter's cheek. No, no, of course not. You've seen the things that make me take issue with them. You were never like that. You're kind and conscientious and so driven, you're not anything like them. Not anything like your father. I can't even remember what he looks like. Well, I never got to meet her, but your good looks come from your mother, I'd bet my life on it. She laughed weakly for a moment, but no one else joined in. Kuvira, I don't know why your father did what he did, I only know you deserved a family and a loving home, and that's what Bader and I gave you. We love you so much, you know that. You're as much my daughter as Opal. You're a buffoon. I know, she said. There was a long moment of silence, and then Kuvira stood up, slipping out of Cora's grasp and letting her hair fall loose again. I'm going to be a sing se. Kuvira, please, I promised. You don't owe my father anything. She started for the door. I don't owe him anything. Chapter 24, Darkness Falls. She should have expected it, but Cora was still surprised at the crowd that had appeared as they were all preparing to leave. There were the 5 of them, the rest of the buffoons, the guards stabling Pepper, provincial security. Cora groaned. She hadn't wanted to make a spectacle of their departure, but their group attracted too much attention to go unnoticed. By the time they were at the airship dock, they had amassed quite the curious following. It was like this the last time we left for a diplomatic trip, Kuvira said as the elevator opened up onto the dock. Mom loves a crowd. Kuvira had recovered somewhat in the few hours they spent preparing to leave, but Cora still noticed a certain somberness hanging over her, an uncomfortable change from her usual quiet confidence. Cora slipped their hands together, which got a small smile out of her. Lynn might just throw me back in jail if I show up in Republic City without you, Mako said. Stick with Sue and you'll be fine. Yeah. They began dispersing onto the dock, but he hung back. Cora, do you have a minute? What, now? She turned to him with a frustrated glance. Kuvira went on ahead, cautiously approaching Pepper alongside Asami. We have literally 1 minute, and if you are going to tell me it's a mistake bringing both Asami and Kuvira along. No, I'll let you deal with that tiger hornet's nest on your own. Even I wasn't dumb enough to put Asami and May in the same room. It's about Jinora. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable with the display of vulnerability. They went to Ba Sing Se about a week ago for some recital. I called down to Kyoshi Island an hour ago, no one's heard from them since before the capital went dark. Maybe if you are not too busy keeping those two from each other's throats. We'll find her, Cora said. Come on, we've got to go. Sue and Kuvira said their goodbyes to their families and each other while Asami offered a small package to Mako. Here, get this to Bolin or Tenzin or someone who can get it to the police. What is it? He asked. Something I worked on with Bader. Designs for a countermeasure against the Spirit Vine weapons. The Equalists have gone completely off the rails since we left, they need to be stopped. I never wanted people to die. Asami chewed on the inside of her cheek for a moment. There's a false bottom in the hope chest in my room, it's got copies of their hideout locations, infrastructure, maps of the sewer systems they use. I don't know how much of it is out of date now, but the police should have it. Mako nodded and tentatively hugged her, patting her back as she kissed his cheek. They parted, and he waited for Sue while dodging Pepper's tongue as she embraced her husband, the new foreign minister and provisional governor. Cora shook some hands and got some hugs of her own, even a fleeting embrace from Opal. Next time you knock, wait, Cora said, to which she could only blush furiously and nod. Wing and Wei got her in a tandem hug next. You take care of our sister, you hear, one of them asked. And make sure you come back in one piece, we'll have enough rules worked out for a doubles match against you two, the other said. Their lightheartedness did wonders to buoy Cora's spirits after such a glum morning. Who would ref? No one else can decipher your crazy rules, anyway. She ducked a few playful punches to the arms and climbed into Pepper's saddle. Asami sat quietly on one side, while Kuvira clung to the other side of the saddle for dear life. So finally broke away from her family and joined Mako on the airship ramp. Good hunting, he yelled as the rotors began to spin up. They disappeared into the hull, and Cora settled into the groove in Pepper's neck. He snorted. Oh, knock it off, You let Mako sit here and I know he weighs more than me. Yip yip. Pepper began lumbering toward the edge of the platform. How fast does this thing go? Kuvira asked, still holding the side of the saddle in a death grip. Depends, Asami said. Even from only the tone of her voice over the wind, Korra could tell she was enjoying Kuvira's apprehension far too much. On what? They ran out of platform, and there was an instant where they hung in the air and their stomachs dropped. How far we fall first? Korra braced herself against Pepper's back in the saddle as the bison tilted and began to shoot downward. The wind whipped through her hair, stymied slightly by the low-level airbending from Pepper that also helped keep the saddle in place. She looked back and saw Kuvira trying her best not to panic, her arms wrapped like pincers around a hole in the side of the saddle while she kept her eyes shut tight. Asami was moving one hand in a tight spiral, diverting most of the rushing air around her. The ground rapidly came into greater and greater focus until individual rocks were visible. Korra tugged on the reins, unnecessary as it was, and Pepper righted himself, launching back into the sky. Soon they were level with the mooring platform, looking at the dispersing crowd and the airship making its way northwest to Republic City over the mountains. That shrunk until they schemed beneath the clouds, hitching a ride on a trade wind to take them around the desert. Okay, keep going this way, Pepper, Korra said, climbing up into the saddle. So, what do you think? Kuvira took a few deep breaths before responding, making every effort not to look over the side. I think it's a good thing we skipped breakfast. Ah, he's not so bad, Asami said, reaching over to scratch Pepper's side. Well, I happen to prefer the ground. I'm strange like that. I have to process some things. She tapped the steel strips on her sleeve in a soothing rhythm, closing her eyes and sitting up a little straighter with her legs crossed. Asami shrugged and took a pai-sho set from her bag. The pieces locked in place on the board to keep them steady on rocking boats, but the principle applied equally well to windy bison saddles. How about a game? Korra looked between them and hesitated. The result of the last time she pushed too hard on someone after emotional damage weighed on her mind. It wasn't a mistake she was eager to repeat, and she decided to give Kuvira her space for the time being. Sure. Set it up, she said, scooting over to Asami's side of the saddle while she laid out the board. Korra's a Water Tribe princess, Kuvira's an Earth Kingdom princess. If I meet a Fire Nation princess, it'll be a neat little hat trick. With an idle flick of his wrist, Mako kept their fire going, making it flare up every so often to keep things interesting. He still wasn't sure how Su had set the airship down in a mountain pass, but there it was, settled in between two sheer escarpments. They might have been in the United Republic already for all he knew, since the border ran through the Bipu Range at the southern end. 4 days in an airship was a far cry from riding on Pepper. For one, the airship never tried to lick him or shake him out into the empty air, although there was something oddly soothing about being around such a large, gentle creature. The airship only plodded northwest under Su's steady direction, leaving Mako to do little but sit around with his cards or his erhu. At least Su had nice things to say about his playing rather than merely tolerating it. He had caught his finger with the knife while cooking earlier, and their only post-dinner music that night was the wind and the far-off howl of wolves. At any rate, they weren't getting to Republic City for at least another day, and so Mako boiled the water for their tea. He rarely had tea and even more rarely made it for himself, but Su was insistent on something to settle their stomachs after dinner. The kettle began whistling until he stopped stoking the fire, lowering to a dull ring as Su came down the ramp to their small campsite. Here we go, she said, bending the top off the kettle and dropping in some leaves to steep. Ginger and lemon, my favorite. Do you have a flavor you like? I prefer coffee, actually. Late nights. Triad upper management doesn't get nights off. She spoke so casually, as if they were talking about the warm breeze in the air. Mako stiffened instinctively like he did any time a Bafong mentioned triad activity, but relaxed once his mind caught up to his body and he remembered it was Su, not Lin. Nothing he said or did seemed to faze her. I guess you could call me a micromanager. I liked to make sure things were running smoothly. You really are just like Lin, you know that. I'm not sure she would agree, Mako said. More like you, maybe. Oh, on opposite sides of the law, sure. But you're both control freaks. Sorry, micromanagers and have this sardonic, self-deprecating kind of humor. And you have much more fun younger siblings, she added with a teasing smile. I see. Did your sister ever make you the Avatar's hostage for 2 months? We weren't so buddy-buddy when she dragged me out of prison to go hunting anarchists. I slept with one eye open for days because I thought she'd send me overboard. So checked the tea, but set the lid back in place to let it continue steeping. You seemed on good enough terms when we left. And she trusted you enough to go back with me to get reinforcements. True. But she was too busy thinking of how to keep Kuvira and Asami from attacking each other to worry much about me. That's about as volatile a combination as I can think of. Maybe she just likes the ego boost of having 2 women after her. I know I would. Mako tried to catch his words as they spilled out, realizing that he may have revealed something that Su didn't know, but she only nodded in understanding. I figured that was why they were so standoffish to one another. But they wouldn't jeopardize such an important mission, would they? Well, Asami tried to buy my apartment building and bulldoze it after she broke up with me. Korra tore a mountain apart the day after Asami broke up with her. I don't know what Kuvira does in a similar situation, but if things go badly we might just find a crater near the desert. Finally, Su seemed satisfied with the tea, poured out 2 mugs and handed one to Mako. Your guess is as good as mine, she's stayed out of relationships. Maybe she didn't want to tell us she preferred women. A joke occurred to Mako about Kuvira and Huan, but as Asami frequently reminded him, he wasn't nearly as funny as he thought, and so he decided against telling it. Those were Su's children, after all. You know, I kind of get where she was coming from. Not the whole secretly being royalty thing, but about her father. I lost my parents when I was 8, too. I can't even remember what they look like, unless I check the picture in my wallet. The only face I see when I try to imagine my mother is. He caught himself again and quickly sipped his tea, biting back a whimper as it scorched his mouth. Another wolf howled, louder than the last. Su waited with an impassive expression, blowing on her own tea while he sputtered and choked his down. The back of his throat burned worse than the time he tried to firebend his own steak. Strong stuff, he choked out. Lin, she said. It wasn't a question. That's not to repeat, now. Su settled closer to Mako and ran her fingers through his hair. It struck him as a rather familiar gesture, if not entirely unwelcome. Her hand was soft. I've left this alone since before the party, but I really would like to know what's going on with you and my sister, Su said softly, putting down her tea and then setting Mako's beside it. Not just because I want to get out of the way if you're going to go crazy on each other when we get to Republic City. You're carrying around a lot of pain, and my maternal instincts can't abide that. Mako laughed mirthlessly and let himself lean into her hand. Am I that obvious? The only way it could be any more apparent is if you had a big sign over your head flashing, "Mommy issues, honey." So I've got issues. Who doesn't? Would it make you feel better if I shared first? Su asked. He shrugged. I won't stop you. I can understand how Kuvira feels, too, she said, shifting over in her seat until they were right against one another. Mako didn't mind. About her father. Feeling abandoned. Feeling angry. It's why I was so disappointed with the prince. Why I made sure Bader and I treated her no differently than the rest of our children. But your father was Counselor Sokka, wasn't he? We met your half-brother on Kyoshi Island. Su nodded. He was my father in the sense that he slept with my mother once, not because he ever acted like it. He went back to his wife before I was born. I spent more time with my Aunt Katara's kids than I ever did with my parents. They probably felt sorry for me more than anything. An uncharacteristic bitterness tinged her voice. Mom pretty much let us do our own thing, and Sokka was always at arm's length. Didn't acknowledge me beyond some birthday presents, and Mom never pushed for him to be a bigger part of my life. Sometimes I wish she never told me who my father was, I wish I had never asked. I wonder if it would have been easier that way. Every time I saw his picture in the paper or heard his voice on the radio, it hurt. Finally I decided that he didn't deserve to be a part of my life, and eventually he passed away without us ever clearing the air. How'd that make me feel? This is going to sound horrible, but it didn't make me feel anything. I was pregnant with the twins at the time. I don't think I could have fit another emotion in my body. My brother called and told me, and it was just another part of my day. I hung up and went back to work. I cried that night, but I think that was more because I was getting up every 15 minutes to pee. She kissed the top of his head while staying right beside him. It was a platonic, motherly thing, and it made him squirm. Mako wanted desperately to lose himself in the moment, to feel some small affection from this woman who owed him nothing, but a deep part of him refused to relax, and instead set him to worry. Your turn. How do women keep wheedling stories out of me? Mako wondered as he took a deep breath. Okay. I wasn't abandoned, and I didn't have a deadbeat dad. My parents were killed in front of me and my brother. That's terrible, Sue murmured, and her voice combined with the comforting crackle of the fire allowed him to relax the tiniest bit. I'm so sorry. It gets worse. It's my fault. What? I wanted to go see that mover that night. I'm the reason we weren't home. I'm the reason they were mugged, Mako said, his voice sullen and thick. I'm the reason they're dead. Oh, sweetie, no, you couldn't have known. You've been blaming yourself all this time. You sound like your sister. Bolin had fallen asleep in the theater. He didn't see what happened, and I didn't know the way home. Republic City is huge. It took about 2 or 3 days before we wound up at the police station. We were filthy by then. He laughed despite himself. Chief Bafong got a hold of us as soon as we walked in. Mako grabbed his tea and took a cautious sip. It wasn't so hot anymore. She sat with us for most of the day, got us clean clothes and some food while she took my statement. Bolin started falling asleep again that night and she didn't want us to sleep in an interview room, so she took us to her house. Breaking dozens of regulations along the way, I'm sure, Sue said, almost as if she were proud of the fact. I never figured Lin for the maternal type. She set us up on her couch and listened to the pro-bending matches on the radio with us. I remember she started groaning when the Cabbage Corp commercials came on. Eventually she ruffled my hair and tucked us in for the night, he said, not even bothering to fight the grin creeping across his lips. I must have missed the letter where Lin said she adopted 2 kids. It'd certainly explain why she takes everything you do so personally. You didn't. Mako ran his hand through his hair. I ran away. Why? Because I blamed myself for my parents dying. I didn't want that to happen to her. My being around her was dangerous. Sue cocked an eyebrow. That doesn't make any sense. I was 8, Mako said dryly. My grasp of cause and effect wasn't fantastic at the time. I left a few days later with Bolin and ended up falling in with the Triads. The next time I saw Lin was 3 years later when a bunch of us got rounded up for running numbers. You poor thing. Well, now you don't sound like Lin. We've been butting heads for a long time and the nicest thing she's said in years was that I had potential. Had being the key word, of course. And hitting on her constantly? Sue asked. Mako felt her shift away slightly. That was more about annoying her enough to stay away from me. I made it clear to my people that I didn't want her harmed, but you never know when someone's going to try and be a hero. It never worked, she kept haranguing me. Have to give her credit for that, I guess. I'd rather she be alive and hate me than dead. That's worked out so far. Without a word, Sue wrapped her arms around Mako and pulled him in against her, resting his cheek in the crook of her shoulder while she stroked his hair. He started and tried to pull away, but her grip was surprisingly firm. What are you? Giving you what you need, she said, pulling him to her side. You just need some affection. Some caring. Knowing that you're not alone. And a night of not thinking you're a bad luck charm for the people around you. I'm not going anywhere. I don't deserve this. Despite his protest, Mako relaxed into her embrace, breathing deeply to keep his composure. I've done really terrible things, Sue. And now you're here with me, doing some good. Do you intend on punishing yourself for the rest of your life? Because if you are, then you're more like Lin than you might want to admit. Sue shifted in place until she was fully hugging him. All you can do is try to forgive yourself and do better from now on. Don't go beating yourself up forever. No one likes a martyr. Mako gripped at the fabric of her tunic, finally feeling the sting of tears. Something snapped nearby, and the fine little hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Another wolf howled. Not louder, closer. He pulled away from Sue and they both scanned their surroundings. It was dark outside of the little sphere of light provided by the fire, and all they could see were spots of motion in the blackness. He heard the wolf before he saw it, snarling as it came prowling up to the fire. Small, angry yellow eyes glared back at him, mottled fangs bared. Mako pushed Sue back and threw a wide punch, sending out an arc of fire that went slightly too high. The wolf dropped low and sprang forward, jaws snapping until they sank around the arm he threw up to shield himself. Little shocks of pain shot up to his shoulder as the wolf wrenched its head from side to side, and out of the corner of his eye Mako saw 2, 3, 4 more wolves padding forward. With his free hand, he jabbed the wolf in the belly, channeling whatever lightning he could call up into it. The shock only made the fangs clamp down tighter, spraying the wolf's muzzle with blood until it went limp. Behind it, the ground beneath the remaining wolves shifted, and spindly earthen spikes from Sue caught 2 of them in the throats. The fangs in his forearm dislodged as the first wolf slumped, and Mako's arm bled freely as it hung at his side. His head began to spin, dizzy with pain and the beginnings of shock. He grabbed a piece of firewood and threw it at the last 2 wolves, landing close enough to one to send it running. The last one hesitated, long enough for him to reach into the fire, grab the scalding teapot, and lob it at the shaggy wolf. His aim was true, and the teapot shattered on the wolf's head, sending the rest of their tea sinking into its eyes and snout. It yelped as it too ran off, and Mako sent another spindle of lightning after it for good measure, ignoring the searing pain in his hand where he had held the teapot. The fading sound of crunching underbrush was the last thing he heard as Sue grabbed him. A dull ringing drowned out everything else, and his head lolled to one side while she dragged him back to the airship. His blood was smeared across her tunic. He would have to apologize for that. Korra watched Kuvira go through the same routine every time they touched down, clambering out of Pepper's saddle and sitting on the ground with a look of overjoyed relief on her face for a moment before she could do anything else. Pepper usually took the opportunity to sniff at her, as if she had acquired some new scent while on his back, but she never seemed to mind. Solid ground, she said to herself as Korra and Asami climbed down from the saddle. It was late in the afternoon when they landed, and they cast long shadows as they surveyed the area. Ba Sing Se should be about another half-day's ride from here. The outer wall will be hard to miss. They made camp as they had for the past few days, making a crude earthen shelter around a fire pit and cannibalizing their empty supply crates for fuel. Korra tried to make sense of one of Sue's scrawled recipes, and eventually she got their stew going. It was a simple mix of vegetables and lacked the meat she would have liked, but what little beef they had been able to bring had been eaten days before. The last of their carrots, kale, and onions would have to do. "How about we spar for a bit?" Kuvira asked, checking the metal strips affixed to her armor in her bag. "Keep ourselves sharp. I know there's been no chance the last few days with all the flying." She almost shuddered at the last word, but Korra made no motion to get up. "I think I'd like to study the map some more while we still have the daylight. The city's massive, I want a better idea of the layout. And I don't want to leave the stew to burn." "Oh. All right. I'll spar with you," Asami said. Korra bristled and looked at both of them. She was well aware that they were civil to one another at best, and being stuck together for days in Pepper's saddle had strained that to the absolute limit. All week she had hoped the gravity of their situation would foster at least a little cooperation, but the best she got was them trading increasingly unsubtle barbs when they weren't sharing the tense silence. Being in the middle of their issues didn't make her feel any better, either. Korra realized 3 days after leaving Zaofa that Mako had been right. The thought made her shudder. Asami shrugged off her jacket, showing the tone in her arms while she tied her hair back. Korra swallowed hard. She must have been hitting the Bafong's gym. Kuvira cocked an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "Not up to it." She smirked, and Korra sighed internally as Kuvira rose to her taunt. "All right, Sato." She fixed a few strips of metal around her thighs and pulled off her tunic, leaving her chest wraps and abdominal muscles exposed. Korra shamefully pressed her legs tighter together while she stared and simmered the stew. "Guess I knew this was coming." "Airbending," Chi blocking, that little glove you have in your bag, it's all fair game. Let's go. I really should stop this, Korra thought as they walked clear of their campsite. Heat baked into them from the last rays of the sun, leaving small trickles of sweat to glisten over their skin. They're going to start stretching. The stew began to bubble over as Korra's tightening fists made the campfire flare up. She snuffed out the fire, not trusting herself to keep it in check, and turned back to her companions. Asami wasted no time in trying to close the distance between them, sidestepping the metal strips that flew her way. Kuvira threw one arm forward and snapped the other back to her side, making the ground beneath Asami turn completely around. Her momentum carried her back a few steps before she was able to correct, whipping back to send a rush of air out from the flick of her wrist. Kuvira staggered back, reeling from the unseen impact, and Asami pressed her advantage. She darted up again, swirling air around her feet to spring forward and land in a slide that ripped at the leg of her pants. Her fists jabbed toward Kuvira's side, but the remaining strips of metal shot up and coalesced to form a barrier. Asami's hands hit cold steel, making her hiss in pain before the strips separated and fell back into place. She knew stopping them was the only course of action that wouldn't result in injury, but Korra could only watch them, entranced. Heat flushed on her face as they traded blows, all the while ignoring the impulse to pull them apart. Asami jammed her boot into the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust that she sent flying with a well-timed gust. The residual blast cost Kuvira her footing, and she gasped as she fell back. Most of the dust missed her, and she pulled the rest out of the air. It all collapsed into a single point and hardened into a rock that went speeding back at Asami. She managed to catch it, but it spun in her palm, rubbing the skin there raw before breaking into dust again. Blood smeared on her undershirt as Asami wiped her hand on it. Kuvira leapt to her feet, bringing the metal on her legs up as wrist guards not an instant before Asami was on top of her again, dispensing with airbending altogether. Her strikes met Kuvira's counters, flying out with all the energy of a coiled snake. Every punch she threw met empty air, until Kuvira grabbed both of her hands and pulled them out at their sides. Their faces were a few hairs' widths apart for a moment before Kuvira's wrist guards unlinked and clamped around Asami's forearms. They dragged her back, arms still outstretched, until Asami brought her legs up and kicked forward. Kuvira's eyes widened an instant before the pocket of air hit her, and she tumbled back as Korra came to her senses and brought a stone wall up between them. "Sparring session's over," she said, finally getting a hold of herself. Korra unfastened the wrist guards and set them over by the fire before bringing the wall down. Asami went up to Kuvira as she righted herself. They locked eyes for a moment, a long moment where Korra prepared to intervene again, and then Asami offered Kuvira her hand. She took it, and there was still tension as Asami pulled her up, but small grins punctuated it as they walked back with Korra to the campfire. "That was clever, with the dust," Kuvira said, reforming her wrist guards into their constituent strips and floating them into her bag. "You managed to turn it around pretty quickly." She nodded. "I grew up with two brothers who wanted to fight, every single day, and not one-on-one. Just quick thinking honed by years of knocking Wing and Wei's heads together. Your style, though, it's very syncretic. You mixed your hand-to-hand with forms from all different kinds of bending styles. I couldn't get a good read on it. Guess I picked up a thing or two from fighting all those bending triads," Asami said with a small trace of pride. Korra looked askance at them, which thankfully went unnoticed. "They're talking. They're not fighting. Did they hit their heads?" Rather than pick at a precarious situation, Korra rekindled the fire and ladled out their dinner while they continued to talk and the sun dipped into the horizon. She finally began studying their map by the light of the campfire, taking note of all the small grooves and irregularities in the walls, committing to memory the places where rail lines ran through the openings. "Korra." "Yeah. The map's upside down," Kuvira said as she rotated it properly. "We're going to be approaching from this direction." "Oh. I knew that. What can you tell us about the city?" She leaned forward and pointed at one corner of the map while Korra held up a handful of fire for light. "Where we're coming in, here in the southwest, is the most heavily trafficked corridor of the outer city. It's the main trade corridor for goods coming in and out. There are control towers here and here that regulate the airships and cargo trains. I doubt they'll notice a single flying bison skimming under the clouds. If they're manned, Asami said, sitting beside Kuvira to look at the map. Or still standing? But we can just fly in. Korra asked. The palace is at the center of the upper ring, it would take hours to get there on foot. The army garrisons in the city do have anti-air measures, but they're designed as emplaced theater defense against airships, not a bison. And if the whole city's gone dark, who knows what's going to be functioning or not. Either way, a precision insertion on Pepper shouldn't be a problem. Hopefully. Korra scanned the map, tapping idly on a plaza in the middle ring. Do you know where there are any theaters, places for dance recitals? I promised Mako we'd look for Jinora and her group. There's the Pengayo, Kuvira said, pointing it out on a street that ran near a small river. She laid her other hand on Korra's thigh, keeping a straight face as she squeezed and made Korra bite her lip. It's one of the oldest theaters in the city. Mom always talked about wanting to do a show there. If the Kyoshi warriors were giving a recital, it'd be at the Pengayo. Okay, that's not too far out of our way. Korra folded up the map while Kuvira quietly slipped her bottle of Beiju from her bag. You still have that? I know, I thought I was going to finish it off right after we left Zaofu. Never got around to it. But now, we could be walking into hell tomorrow, she said before taking a quick belt of the Beiju and wincing slightly at the sting in her throat. Might as well make the most of tonight. She passed the bottle between Asami, Korra and herself as their campfire died down. Pepper's snores were surprisingly entertaining after another third of the Beiju was gone, Korra thought. They managed to get the rest of the story about Mako and the shock glove out of a thoroughly red-faced Asami, but as the night wore on they became quieter, and Kuvira in particular said less and less as their surroundings grew darker. The moon hung high overhead by the time the dwindling remains of the Beiju sat forgotten near their feet. Are you all right? Asami finally asked. Korra slipped her hand under Kuvira's and leaned against her, relishing the pleasant warmth beneath her tunic on the cool desert night. Never better, Kuvira said, rather unconvincingly. They both looked at her, and Kuvira wilted under their gazes. I'm just fine. Her small smile wavered as she ran her hand through her hair. I thought I got to a place where hearing things about my father wouldn't rattle me. I haven't even thought about him in almost a year before this last week, and now it's become a huge deal. No one expects you to be totally above all of this, Korra said as Asami tentatively placed a hand on her back. And for what it's worth, you reacted to the whole Yuri actually royalty thing better than me. I threw up. Kuvira laughed weakly. That's right, you're the crown princess of the Southern Water Tribe. I guess the Avatar title usually supersedes everything else. Yeah. So it's a big shock for a while, but it starts being normal pretty fast. Suen Bader knew and didn't treat you any differently because of it. And Su said you were what, 14th in line for the throne. As far as she knows. I've tried sounding it out in my head to distract myself from flying. Princess Kuvira. Ugh. I know, Lieutenant Governor doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but at least I could feel like I earned that. It was a sinecure, but it meant something to me. Both Korra and Asami let her speak, trading brief glances with each other as Kuvira continued. I spent so many years being angry at my father. Wondering why he didn't want me. Wondering what I did wrong. And not even Mom knew what that was. She laced her fingers up with Korra's, drawing an impassive glance from Asami. I messed up all my pillows with crying every night. And every day I was scared out of my mind that Suen Bader would just dump me somewhere else if I did anything else wrong. I tried to be perfect for them, and I was terrified every single time I screwed up. I'm still afraid when I screw up. Her voice was small and plaintive, a far cry from her usual cool, commanding tone. It took me so long to let them love me, so long to stop asking myself all the time why my father abandoned me. I figured if he didn't want to care about me, I didn't want to care about him. I wanted to be the daughter he didn't deserve instead. He missed out, Korra said, squeezing Kuvira's hand. She smiled. Thanks. Sorry about throwing all the heavy stuff at you. Asami rolled her neck and leaned forward on her little earthen seat. No, I know what you mean, being mad at your father. I knew my dad's company was the reason we were rich, and that's why we were robbed. That's why burglars killed my mother. Might have been a silly thought process, but I was 6. And then he got distant for years, when I needed him the most. A big part of why I joined with the Equalists was to make him happy. She nodded, happy to forget her own woes for a moment. No one screws you up worse than your parents. They shared a quick laugh before looking guiltily at Cora. She shrugged. It's okay. No one screws you up worse than your crazy anarchist kidnappers doesn't have the same ring to it. I get the humor anyway. Kuvira pushed up against her, lips brushing on the side of Cora's neck. You know why I like you, she asked, her voice cool and husky once more. You don't make me worry about being perfect. You make me feel okay being me. She cupped Cora's cheeks and kissed her gently, bumping their noses together and following slightly when Cora pulled back. Ah, wait. Oh. Kuvira glanced back to where Asami sat, breathing heavily as she watched them. Her hand rested over her stomach, and she gripped at her undershirt as Kuvira turned around to face her. I wouldn't want to be left out, either. Asami's eyes went wide as Kuvira grabbed her shirt and pulled her into a deep kiss. Cora gasped, biting her lip while arousal flared up like wildfire between her legs. After a moment Asami jerked back, leaving a thin trail of saliva hanging between their lips. Her whole face was a bright red in the low light. What? Like I said, I want to make the most of tonight, Kuvira said, putting a lock of Asami's hair behind her ear. I still owe Cora from the other morning, but I don't think she'd mind if you joined in. I certainly wouldn't. All Cora minded was that her pants were still on, and she nodded furiously as she fumbled with her belt. She didn't dare pinch herself to see if she was asleep, because if she was she didn't want to wake up. Asami hesitated for a moment, looking at both of them in turn, before tentatively leaning forward and kissing Kuvira. It was all the prompting she needed. Kuvira pulled her down onto their bedrolls, grabbing Cora as she did. She straddled Asami and bit lightly at her neck while Cora inched over and slowly kissed her. The feel of Asami's lips was pleasantly familiar, soft and sweet and tasting faintly of beiju. Warmth rushed through Cora and threatened to burst when Kuvira slipped a hand under her shirt, fingers running over the scars and hard muscle of her abdomen. Cora moaned and broke her kiss to let Kuvira strip off both her and Asami's shirts before discarding her own, ripping through her chest wraps with ease and letting them fall away. She heard the snap of Asami's bra clasp while Kuvira loosened her wraps, leaving them all exposed from the waist up. Kissing two people at once was odd, Cora thought, but she quickly got used to the feeling. She rolled her hips and wriggled out of her pants while Kuvira nipped at Asami's collarbone. Watching them run their hands over each other, panting and sweating, Cora thought she would feel jealous, but instead all she felt was mounting, excited anticipation. Her inner thighs were soaked by the time she kicked her pants away, and the strangely thrilling scent of her own arousal filled their crude shelter. Well, Kuvira said, tugging off Asami's pants and tossing them aside. Someone's eager. All Cora could do was nod as they turned their attention on her. Kuvira propped her up into a sitting position, her breasts pressing into Cora's back as they faced Asami. One of her hands laced up with Cora's and traced down her stomach, provoking a shiver as they drifted between her legs with Asami watching. She sat up opposite them, pushing her panties aside as their hands began moving slowly up and down. Look how wet you've gotten her, Kuvira murmured, kissing Cora's neck. The question of who she was addressing faded into unimportance as she guided their fingers over Cora's clit, gliding slowly, almost languorously up and down. Warm pressure welled up in her core, rising and falling at the whims of Kuvira's rhythm. Asami took quick, shallow breaths while she touched herself, whimpering and shaking as they watched one another. You're both so beautiful. Asami's cried out as she plunged two fingers into herself, hips rolling as she began to pick up her pace. The soft, smooth muscle in her stomach tensed up, leaving her to shudder furiously through her first orgasm. She hunched forward with a deep breath, and a fine, sticky spray of arousal hit Cora's leg. Her spicy scent mingled with Cora's own, heady in its thickness. As much as she wanted to speed up and break through that last wall of pleasure, their fingers worked at the same steady pace, fast enough to keep her hips bucking but not so quick that she went careening over the edge. Please, Kuvira. Maybe Asami can help us. She took their hands away, leaving a dull ache in the absence of stimulation, and nudged a blissful Asami with her foot. She shifted and laid on her stomach, kissing along Korra's thighs with one hand still between her own legs while Kuvira rested Korra down on her back. Kuvira's pants disappeared into a pile with the others before she threw one leg over and straddled Korra's face. She looked up and clasped Kuvira's hips, admiring the new view of her hard muscle and taking in the scent of her arousal as she flitted her tongue over Kuvira's clit. Her arousal had a sharp, intoxicating taste to it, complex and delicious all at once, and Korra eagerly lapped it up. "Ah, that's good, Korra, so good, a little harder, I won't break," she said, grabbing a handful of Korra's hair and slowly rocking her hips from side to side. Fuck, Korra." Her words dissolved into moans, making the ground beneath their bedrolls tremble. Asami finally hit home, bringing her tongue up along Korra's slit and tasting the arousal there. It made her whimper and roll her hips up into Asami's soft, gentle mouth. The wiry black hair between Kuvira's legs brushed at Korra's nose, slick with excitement. Pleasure jolted through her body, making her sweat and squirm with anticipation. "Good ah." Panting heavily, Kuvira grabbed the sides of Korra's head and held her still, bucking her hips back and forth. Arousal soaked Korra's face, warm and sweet. She lost her grip after a moment, and whatever she tried to say dissolved into incoherence as she pressed her legs together around Korra. Kuvira threw her head back and balled her hands into fists, trembling so violently that everything around them shook. The vibration in Asami's tongue finally set Korra over the edge, flooding herself with so much stimulation that her eyes and scars briefly glowed white. Still quivering through her aftershocks, Kuvira managed to settle herself in beside Korra, kissing her lightly while Asami crawled up into Korra's other side. Everything was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and their panting, as they wondered absently if they had really just done that. Soon Asami and Kuvira's breathing leveled off to the calm rhythms of sleep, and Korra snuffed out the fire before joining them, utterly exhausted, utterly satisfied. When Korra awoke, it was with two arms wrapped around her. She kept her eyes closed for a moment and enjoyed the warmth of Kuvira and Asami's bodies on either side of her, loving the feeling of their hands intertwined atop her chest. Okay, that really happened. She had a slight headache from all the beiju, but Korra was fairly certain that the whining she was hearing was not a result of being hungover. There was an odd smell, too cinder, maybe. And it seemed rather dark for morning. She was still too groggy to tell. After a few moments she opened her eyes and looked over Asami's leg at the fire pit, still sitting extinguished. Reluctantly, Korra sat up, rustling their pushed-together bedrolls enough to rouse the others. Asami rolled onto her back and looked at them both with a deep blush. "We never speak of this again. But can we do it again?" Kuvira asked, giving them a plainly hungry look. "I've never come so hard in my life, hey, do you smell that?" Korra stood on unsteady legs and stepped out of their shelter. Pepperak. Something bitter and diffuse caught in her mouth, doubling her over in a fit of coughing. Their bison was covered in soot, whining as he tried to shake his fur clean. Korra sent a rush of air his way to clear the fur on his head before she looked around. The sun was masked by a black cloud, and more soot was falling every minute on a steady wind from the northeast. Some landed on Korra, black and flaky on her skin. Cinder. Kuvira and Asami stepped out of their shelter with hastily donned clothing. "Ash," Asami said, covering her mouth. "What in the world?" Kuvira brushed some from her bare feet, only to have more soot fall in its place. "Where did it all come from?" "Basing se," Korra said. "It's burning." Chapter 25, City of Walls and Secrets. Long bars of sunlight filtered into the airship, and with the dawn Mako slipped from restless sleep and into pain. The image of snapping, snarling jaws jolted him upright, sending a rush of dizziness to his head. His breathing was slow and ragged as he looked down at his body. His chest was bare, and scratchy gauze covered his left forearm. Blood spotted through the bandages. Dark, stale blood. He realized he was in the airship's infirmary, squeezed onto a little cot in the corner that was definitely not made for someone his height. Mako turned and got his feet to the floor, taking his first unsteady steps toward the exit, but the door opened before he could get there. Su stepped in with fresh sheets, looking impassively at him, and Mako wondered for a moment where his shirt had gotten to. And then Su slapped him. Her palm sang across his cheek, weighted down with the metal wristbands she always wore. There was a loud, Sharp crack, and Mako backed away while grabbing at his face. "What the hell did you think you were doing?" she asked, taking another step toward him. Her voice was raw and choked with worry, barely restrained behind her politician's facade. Small beads of moisture hung precariously around her eyes. "I think you knocked a filling loose." Su punched his undamaged arm and then fell against him, half hugging and half clawing at his back. Her breaths were quick and uneven, and she shook as he returned her hug. "You don't go and try to be a big damn hero," she said, seemingly torn between continuing to hug him and going back to hitting him. "You don't." "I didn't try and do anything." Mako gave her a pat on the head and slowly separated them. Her gaze kept slipping to his chest, and he crossed his arms over it. "I've just developed a tendency to act quickly when people are in danger. No glory-seeking, honest." She laughed weakly. "Good. Didn't want you expecting the keys to Zaofu or something." "Too bad, I was hoping for my own dome." She smiled, taking a small step closer to him and placing one light hand on his side, her palm flush with warmth. Wind howled outside, rocking them slightly. So. Yes. Who's steering the ship?" Without another word, Su pursed her lips and hurried out of the infirmary. Mako went to his cabin and retrieved a fresh shirt before joining her on the bridge, where he could see their approach to Republic City. The buildings and bay gleamed as the sun broke over the mountains to the east, but something was wrong. Even from high up, everything was quiet and still, far too subdued for the morning. Mako looked down at the district they were over, and nothing moved. The only motion visible was the pair of airships approaching them. "Did they change the police insignia in the last few months?" Su asked. "No." Mako took the radio handset and opened a channel. "Those are the United Forces." After a tense few minutes of convincing the border patrol that they were indeed a diplomatic flight, the military escorted them down to the only moorings that hadn't been commandeered, atop the central police station. The airship's cables shot out and latched around their anchor points before reeling in, and by the time they were close enough to lower the ramp there was a figure emerging from the stairwell. Mako tensed, but Su bent the ramp down and nearly ran out. "Lin." "Su? What are you doing here?" She seemed much more enthusiastic about throwing herself into an embrace than her sister was about receiving it, but Lin hugged her warmly after a moment, surprising Mako. He never saw her as the hugging type. The sound of his footsteps on the ramp drew her attention, and her eyes narrowed when she saw him. More to the point, what are you doing here with him? Lin brushed Su aside and walked slowly to the airship ramp, trying hard not to wince. A brace was affixed to her right leg, Mako saw, and anger at the Equalists surged in him. "Hi, Chief. I was sorry to hear about your injury," he said as evenly as he could, noting how unfamiliar she looked in civilian clothes. She seemed smaller. More human. Unhappier. "Yeah, I'll bet you were. I hope Kaed hasn't been working you too hard." She clenched her jaw. "How do you know about her?" Common sense cautioned him against explaining how he had paid for one of the Southern Water Tribe's best healers to move to Republic City after her hospitalization. Friend of a friend. That wasn't entirely untrue. She was Kija's second cousin once removed or some such, but Lin seemed unhappy with it all the same. "I don't need you spying on me. Now what are you doing back here? Where's the Avatar?" "She and Asami went with Kuvira to Ba Sing Se," Su said, going up to her. "It's part of why we're here. There may be a problem." "Yeah, well, we've got our own problems here right now, as I'm sure you saw. How did they even end up in Zaofu? Didn't they leave to go hunt anarchists?" "We had to return some scrolls," Mako said. "Lin, I'd love to bring you up to speed, but it's important that we speak to the council as soon as we can." She gave them a bitter laugh. "You're about a week too late for that. There is no council anymore." Mako felt his stomach drop. No council meant no one to keep Lin from tossing him back in jail. This wouldn't have anything to do with the military airships all over the city, would it? Believe it or not, that's unrelated. Anti-equalist measures. Your brother got a mob going and replaced the council with Tenzin as the new president, and himself as the second in command. And all the United Forces have done is put everyone on edge while the Equalists and your triads run amok. Tenzin's the president. Su asked. That might make things easier, actually. Don't get on me about my triads. I haven't been running anything from Zaofa or the Southern Water Tribe, Mako said indignantly. But you know that already, because I'm sure you tapped the lines again and I never showed anyone how to rewire them. I was out of the city, paying off my debt to society the way I was told to. I've had 2 bombs go off in my face, gotten my blood bent, and a wolf tried to use my arm as a toothpick. He waved his bandaged forearm in front of her to emphasize his point, but then stopped and took a deep breath. 5 minutes in Republic City and he could already feel himself slipping into his old ways again. We're here because Cora asked us to come back. Ba Singh Se went completely dark and she asked for an army if it needs to be taken back. Our army is busy right now, Lin said. Su put a hand on her shoulder, and her scowl faded to something resembling exasperation. You know what? You might be able to help. Both of you. Hyan is the acting police chief until I'm out of this embrace, and he wants the military gone as much as I do. It sends a bad message. So, do you think you can convince Tenzin to divert the United Forces to stand by on the border? If he's forgiven me for all the grief Kia and I used to give him, she said with a shrug. And me? Mako asked. You're a little more complicated. Lin brought them downstairs, where Mako noticed that she had settled quite comfortably into her old role in all but name. She barked orders, signed off on forms while she walked slowly through the building, and even eked out the beginnings of a smile when some junior officers stood at attention as she passed. They went into a small, darkened antechamber that looked into an interview room through one-way glass. An officer leaned on the wall beside the door, bending one of the chair legs to be slightly shorter than the others. I know you're not used to being on this side of the mirror, so I can explain if you'd like, Lin said. Just do whatever it is you're doing. She tapped her fingers on the glass, and the officer disappeared through the door for several minutes. How's Mom? Lin asked. Su sighed. Same as always. The door opened again, and the officer dragged in a man with a long cut across his cheek and unmistakably Fire Nation features. He didn't even get him into the chair before Mako spoke. Cheng. All I needed to know. Lin tapped the glass again and they took him back out, sealing the door up behind them. That was the equalist they arrested right before your brother staged his little coup by proxy. Mako cocked an eyebrow. Then he must be delusional, because he's a damn good firebender. He's done some construction work for me. I don't care about whatever extortion racket he had going for you, that's all small time now. I think Bolin planted him in that meeting to get everyone on board with his nonsense. What I don't know is why the triads would work for him. For the same reason triads do anything, Su said as they left the observation room. Money. That seemed like a rather simplistic explanation to Mako, but he knew his interest in mounting an appreciable force against the Equalists hadn't been a popular one. Judging by the presence of the military in the city, he wished he had spent more time spreading that interest. Is that all you wanted? Mako asked. Not quite. I want you to find out what your brother is doing. I have an idea, but I want proof. Be subtle. Don't interfere, Lin said. They left the station through one of the side doors, and he saw a strangled city. Large earthen walls had been erected in front of alleys, while soldiers and police made up 9 of every 10 people he saw. Everyone else hurried along, their heads down whenever they had to pass someone in uniform. Several minutes went by before he saw a running car, and the rickety old tram that trundled through the district was empty. Even the guy who sold the egg rolls that Mako liked from a cart on the corner was gone. This is awful, he said as they made their way to City Hall. The city's going to collapse if it keeps up like this. Useless, too. Lin waved her hand north. They bombed the naval depot the other night with a curfew in place. She pushed past the soldiers on the City Hall steps and ushered them inside. The monument to the elements in the rotunda had been removed security risk, Lin explained, and she brought them into what had been the council chamber. A guard tried to stop them, but a withering glare from Lin cowed him. Nothing looked all that different, Mako thought, except that Tenzin was at the center of the main table and he seemed much more haggard. They turned their attention to them when the door swung shut. I think that's everything for now, thank you, Tenzin said. He stood, the others following suit, and everyone but him and Bolin filed out to their offices. Su hurried ahead of her sister while Mako stuck beside her. "So I don't see you for a few months and you end up in charge of the United Republic?" Su asked, giving her cousin a brief hug and a peck on the cheek. "I guess congratulations are in order, Mr. President." "No, they really aren't," he said with exasperation. Bolin grinned. "So humble. It's good to see you again, Governor." "And Mako?" He came down into the gallery and pulled him into a bone-crushing hug. Mako felt his feet lift up off the ground as Bolin leaned back. "Good to see you too, bro," he gasped out. Bolin set him down, and he took a moment to catch his breath. "New job. Desperate times, unfortunately. We're done here, why don't you and I get something to eat? I want to hear what it's been like running around with the Avatar." Mako's stomach growled. "That sounds good, but there's one thing Su and I have to do first." "Su?" "Oh, the Governor. How'd you two get stuck together?" "The girls tossed me out of their club," Mako said, going to the center of the chamber beside Suyin. "Mr. President." "Mr. Han," Tenzin said. That threw him off kilter. No one ever used his surname. "Thank you for safely seeing Jinora to Kyoshi Island." "Oh, don't mention it." He wasn't aware of Jinora's current situation, then. "Avatar Korra asked me and Su Governor Bufang, I mean to bring you up to speed on what's happening in the Earth Kingdom. We lost contact with Ba Sing Se about a week ago," Tenzin said. "The Fire Nation and the Water Tribes did as well. Were you having the same problems?" Su nodded. "I was on the phone when all the lines went dead. We know it wasn't an issue with our infrastructure, because calls to the other provinces went through without a problem. They couldn't contact the capital, either. Avatar Korra and Asami went with my daughter to see what's going on, but if there is a problem. And we have every reason to believe there is," Mako said. "The Earth Kingdom military wouldn't be able to regain control of Ba Sing Se. They simply don't have the manpower anymore. If more than a third of the city began rioting, the whole situation would spiral out of control in a matter of days. We came here to ask for military aid, should it prove necessary." "This sounds like it could become a big problem," Bolin said, sitting at the table beside Tenzin. "But a big Earth Kingdom problem? Surely you've seen that our forces are already strained. And we have an ambassador from the Earth Kingdom. She's made no such request for any aid, military or otherwise, and you aren't a plenipotentiary, Governor. You don't have the authority to make that kind of request." For a moment Su only looked at him, blinking in incredulity. "That's because no one in our government has been able to get a request to Ambassador Lien at the embassy here, Mr. Vice President. As far as we know, every line into and out of Ba Sing Se is dead. And our request is on behalf of Avatar Korra, not the Queen. We're not asking for an invasion force, sir," Mako said, putting his attention on Tenzin. "An infantry and engineering brigade on standby would be more than enough. I wish we had more information for you, but Korra was confident that this was going to quickly become a much bigger problem." Tenzin ran his hand over his head as Bolin stood up. "That's thousands of soldiers, invasion force or not, that you want ready to jump over the border at the drop of a hat. All on the word of a single woman, and to solve a hypothetical problem that isn't on our land. Korra sent you here on a fool's errand, Mako." He clenched his fist behind his back. Bolin had no business saying that about the Avatar, Mako thought. Our whole border is with the Earth Kingdom. If Ba Sing Se falls apart, that's millions of refugees, not to mention the effect it would have on the surrounding provinces. How soon after do you think the rest of the country would go to pieces? I've seen their bandit problem firsthand. All the order and peace of the United Republic will start looking real good, real fast to them." Bolin drummed his fingers on the table, but had no time to reply before Mako spoke again, still keeping his focus on Tenzin. His resolve was flagging, but they needed something to push him through Bolin's objections. All or nothing, Mako thought. "Jinora's there too, sir." Air rushed through the room as Tenzin shot up out of his seat. "What are you talking about?" "I called down to Kyoshi Island before we left Zaofu. As far as they knew, the Kyoshi warriors were in the city when it went dark. Korra was going to look for them. He paced back and forth, bristling. That seemed to do the trick. Sonny can liaise with the United Forces commanders and bring a force to bear. Izuna will have to go to the embassy and make sure possibly sending troops into the Earth Kingdom won't set off a firestorm. I can handle the ambassador, Bolin said, slipping his placating politician's smile back on. She owes me a favor, anyway. If that's all, Mr. President. Mako bowed slightly before Bolin brought him out of the room and into the rotunda, nudging him along with a hand on his back. What the hell was all that? Mako asked, his voice barely more than a hiss. Earth Kingdom problem? Fool's errand? Plenipotentiary. Do you even know what that word means? Yes, I know what that word means. You're not the only one who knows what words mean, he said in a huff. Why didn't you back me up in there? Bolin opened his mouth to respond, but as they left the rotunda they were set upon by a small army of reporters and photographers that had assembled on the stairs of the building, much to the annoyance of the soldiers and guards nearby. He sighed good-naturedly and adjusted the lapels of his jacket. The press, however, swarmed Mako, almost blinding him with flashes from their cameras. Is Avatar Korra with you? What's happening in Ba Sing Se? Why did you arrive in a Zaofu airship? Questions. Mako didn't like reporters asking questions. No, I don't know, and it was what we had. No more questions, Bolin said, guiding them through the crowd. Come on, let's go to Nerux. The soldiers won't bother us. Some of the reporters followed them for about half a block, still firing questions until they subsided. Parts of the city seemed to be picking up, with people filling the sidewalks and streetcars, but everything was quiet. There were no loud conversations, no children weaving in and out in a game of tag, no bustle, no liveliness. This isn't the city I remember. You've been gone for months, Bolin said as they made their way down the street. Things have changed. You're telling me. Now what in the world were you doing in there? Mako, I would have liked nothing more than to give you the whole regiment that's in the city right now. The press is already ripping into Tenzin over them being here. But we have to think about the United Republic first. I don't want Ba Sing Se to go up in flames any more than you do, and you're right about the effects it would have. Ambassador Lien will feel the same way, I'm sure. But there's a right way to do this and a wrong way. I only want to see that we do this the right way. With you saving the day with your negotiations, Mako said as they stepped into the restaurant. Bolin rolled his eyes before calling over a waiter. He sat down at their table across from his brother. You make it sound so dirty. Tenzin making snap decisions isn't going to endear this new administration to the city. Yeah, and don't think we're not going to talk about that, Mako said under his breath. This way, everyone gets what they want. Honestly, bro, that's the way politics works. You've been spending too much time with the Avatar. Their food came after a few minutes, and Mako picked at his noodles while Bolin did most of the talking, managing in some strange way to say very little. Mako nodded at the appropriate times and even looked interested, but his thoughts were far away. His task from Lin hung heavy on his mind, and so drifted, not entirely unwelcome, into his thoughts as he ate. Bafongs were going to be the death of him. Mako shook his head clear and turned his attention back to his brother. What are you playing at, Bolin? Check the description for the links to the author.